Tonight we uncover a terror that stalked Vatican halls for over 1,000 years. Not demons with pitchforks or fallen angels with burned wings. Something far more dangerous to the Church's foundation. Beings that could appear as perfect lovers, seduce the faithful, and steal something more precious than gold or souls. They could steal belief itself. While the Church painted devils as obvious enemies, Succubi and Incubi moved in shadows, wearing faces of desire, whispering truths that made priests question everything. This is the story of why the Vatican's greatest fear wasn't evil incarnate, but creatures that made sin feel like salvation. The bells of San Marcello al Corso had just finished tolling Vespers when Brother Francesco found him. Father Alessandro Torretti lay sprawled on the cold stone floor of his cell, his cassock torn, his lips moving in whispered syllables that belonged to no earthly tongue. Candles had burned down to waxy stumps around him, and strange symbols were carved into the wooden prayer desk with what appeared to be his own fingernails. It was October 13th, 1486. The same day that would later be whispered about in Vatican corridors for centuries to come. Brother Francesco crossed himself and backed away. The sounds coming from Father Torretti's mouth weren't Latin, weren't Italian, weren't any language he'd heard in 20 years of monastery life. They were melodic, almost musical, with lilting rises and falls that seemed to echo off the walls longer than physics should allow. And beneath the strange words, barely audible, was something else. Laughter, soft, feminine, intoxicating. When the monastery's physician finally arrived, Torretti's eyes snapped open. They weren't the brown eyes the brothers knew. They were silver, reflective like mirrors, and in them, the physician swore he saw the face of a woman more beautiful than any mortal could be. "She comes with the starlight," Torretti whispered in perfect Latin, his voice carrying harmonics that made the windows vibrate. "She teaches what the Church forbids." Then he collapsed, and his eyes returned to brown. The investigation that followed would become one of the most classified cases in Vatican history. Cardinal Francesco della Rovere, the future Pope Sixtus IV, personally traveled from Rome to interrogate the priest. What he discovered in Torretti's cell defied every theological framework the Church possessed. The carved symbols weren't random scratches. They formed coherent patterns that matched no known script, yet somehow conveyed meaning to those who looked upon them. The Vatican's best scholars were summoned in secret. One, a Dominican named Fra Benedetto, spent 3 days studying the markings before suffering what witnesses described as a crisis of faith so profound he never spoke again. But it was Torretti's confession that truly terrified the Church hierarchy. Under interrogation, the priest described visitations that had begun 6 months earlier. Always at night, always when he was alone in prayer. A woman of impossible beauty would appear in his cell, her skin luminous as moonlight, her voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge. She claimed to be neither angel nor demon, but something older, something that existed in the spaces between the sacred and profane. "She showed me visions," Torretti told his interrogators, his voice carrying an unsettling serenity. "The true history of our faith, the books that were burned, the Gospels that were hidden, the names of God that were forbidden because they held too much power." The woman, if woman she was, had taught him languages that predated Latin, predated Hebrew, predated any tongue spoken by man. She revealed mathematical formulas that described the movement of celestial bodies with accuracy that wouldn't be achieved by secular astronomy for another century. She whispered alchemical secrets that could transmute base metals into gold, and more troubling still, base souls into something divine. But most dangerous of all, she had shown him pleasure. Not the crude physical lusts that common demons might employ, but ecstasy of a spiritual nature so profound that earthly worship paled in comparison. In her embrace, Torretti claimed, he had touched the face of God more directly than any prayer or sacrament had ever allowed. "The Church teaches us to seek the divine through suffering, through denial," he told Cardinal della Rovere. "But she showed me that the sacred and the sensual are not enemies. They are partners in the dance of creation. Every moment of pleasure, every instant of desire, every breath of passion, these are prayers more honest than anything spoken in Latin." The Cardinal's response was immediate and brutal. Torretti was declared possessed and subjected to the most extreme forms of exorcism the Church could devise. But the rituals had no effect. The priest showed no signs of demonic influence by any known measure. He remained lucid, articulate, and most disturbingly, at peace. It was this peace that convinced the Vatican they were dealing with something unprecedented. Demons left their victims tormented, broken, consumed by anguish. But Toretti radiated a calm that bordered on the divine. He spoke of his encounters not with the fevered ramblings of madness, but with the measured certainty of revelation. More priests began coming forward with similar stories. Father Giovanni in Florence described dreams of a dark-haired enchantress who revealed the hidden meanings in Scripture. Brother Marco in Padua claimed visitations from a being who taught him to see God in acts the Church called sinful. A young novice in Naples spoke of ecstatic unions with a creature that showed him the falseness of clerical celibacy. All described the same impossible beauty. All reported the same mixture of carnal pleasure and spiritual illumination. All emerged from their encounters with knowledge they claimed came from divine sources, yet which contradicted fundamental church doctrine. The pattern was unmistakable, and it terrified Vatican officials more than any plague or military threat ever could. These entities, whatever they were, weren't simply corrupting the faithful. They were offering alternative paths to the divine. They were teaching that the Church's monopoly on salvation was a lie. Cardinal Della Rovere compiled his findings in a report that was immediately classified under the highest papal seal. Only 3 copies were made, and 2 were destroyed within a decade. The surviving document, locked in the deepest vaults of the Vatican secret archives, contained a conclusion that would shape church policy for centuries. These beings do not seek to destroy faith, but to redirect it. They offer truths mixed with seduction, wisdom wrapped in forbidden pleasure. They are more dangerous than any demon because they do not appear as enemies of the divine, but as alternative messengers of it. They threaten not our souls, but our authority. The investigation of Father Toretti was quietly closed. The priest himself was transferred to a remote monastery in the Alps, where he lived in isolation until his death 30 years later. His cell at San Marcello was sealed and blessed repeatedly, but even today, Vatican records show that it remains off-limits to overnight stays. The carved symbols were scraped from the prayer desk and the wood burned, but photographs taken by a Vatican archivist in 1923 suggest the markings had somehow returned, carved deeper than before. What happened to Father Toretti became the template for how the Church would handle similar cases for the next 5 centuries. Silence, isolation, denial. Because admitting that these encounters were real would mean admitting that the Church's understanding of good and evil, sacred and profane, might be fundamentally flawed. But the incidents didn't stop. If anything, they multiplied. Across medieval Europe, priests and monastics began reporting encounters with beings that defied classification. Beautiful, terrible, seductive creatures that offered forbidden knowledge wrapped in divine ecstasy. Entities that claimed the Church had built its power on suppressed truths and artificial separations between the physical and spiritual realms. The Vatican's response would evolve from case-by-case investigation to systematic suppression. They would develop new forms of exorcism, create secret orders dedicated to hunting these beings, and ultimately construct a theology that painted any mixture of the sacred and sensual as inherently evil. But they never stopped the visitations. They only learned to hide them better, because the entities that visited Father Toretti and countless others weren't trying to destroy the Church. They were trying to reveal what the Church was hiding. And that, as Cardinal Della Rovere had noted in his classified report, made them infinitely more dangerous than any traditional demon. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. And some truths are seductive enough to risk everything for. In the winter of 1487, just months after the Toretti incident, Pope Innocent VIII convened what church records would later cryptically refer to as the Commission on Matters of Spiritual Discernment. The official purpose was to examine claims of false mysticism among the clergy. The real purpose was to solve a theological crisis that threatened the very foundations of Christian doctrine. The problem was simple to state, but impossible to resolve. How could entities that appeared to grant genuine spiritual insight be classified as evil? Cardinal Giovanni Battista Cibo, who would become Pope Innocent VIII's successor, posed the question that kept Vatican theologians awake at night. If these beings lead souls to divine truth through forbidden means, Are they servants of God or Satan? And if we cannot tell the difference, what does that say about our understanding of either? The Church had spent over a millennium developing a theology based on clear distinctions: good versus evil, sacred versus profane, divine revelation versus demonic deception. But the entities plaguing clergy across Europe refused to fit into these neat categories. They offered wisdom that proved accurate, prophecies that came true, and spiritual experiences that transformed lives in measurably positive ways. Yet they did so through means the Church deemed forbidden. Thomas Aquinas had never contemplated this possibility when he wrote his definitive treatises on angels and demons 2 centuries earlier. His theological framework assumed that divine beings would operate through Church-approved channels, while demonic beings would be recognizable by their corruption and lies. These new entities followed neither pattern. Brother Antonius of Pisa, one of the Church's most respected theologians, spent 3 years studying documented cases of clerical visitations. His classified report, buried in Vatican archives until its accidental discovery in 1978, revealed the depth of the theological crisis. These beings appear to possess knowledge that surpasses human understanding, yet they impart it through means our doctrine declares sinful. They teach mathematical principles that prove sound, astronomical observations that prove accurate, and theological insights that prove profound. Most troubling, those who receive such instruction report spiritual elevation rather than spiritual degradation. How can the tree of sin bear the fruit of enlightenment? The Commission's deliberations stretched across 18 months of secret sessions. Cardinals, bishops, and the Church's most learned scholars wrestled with questions that had no satisfactory answers within existing theology. If spiritual truth could be accessed through sensual means, what became of the Church's insistence on celibacy and denial? If divine knowledge could be transmitted through beings that appeared as lovers, what separated these encounters from the mystical marriages described by saints and mystics? Even more troubling were the comparative studies being conducted in secret. Vatican scholars discovered that the knowledge imparted by these entities often aligned perfectly with suppressed Christian text gospels that had been deemed heretical and destroyed, mystical traditions that had been banned as too dangerous for public consumption. It was as if these beings were preserving and disseminating the very knowledge the Church had worked to eliminate. Father Girolamo Savonarola, before his famous campaigns against corruption in Florence, was quietly commissioned to investigate whether these entities might be angels operating outside official Church channels. His preliminary findings, suppressed after his execution, suggested something far more complex. These beings speak of God with intimate knowledge, yet they mock our rituals as empty theater. They demonstrate powers that surpass those claimed by our saints, yet they refuse to acknowledge papal authority. They love as angels are said to love, with perfect understanding and infinite compassion, yet they do so through flesh in ways our doctrine forbids. If they are demons who preach love of God. If they are angels who reject our interpretation of God's will. The theological implications were staggering. The Church's entire authority structure rested on the claim that it served as the exclusive intermediary between humanity and the divine. But these entities suggested that direct communion with the sacred was not only possible, but natural. They implied that the separation between spiritual and physical love was artificial, imposed by human institutions rather than divine mandate. Most dangerous of all, they demonstrated that ecstasy, the overwhelming spiritual bliss that mystics spent lifetimes trying to achieve, could be reached through the very physical pleasures the Church condemned. This wasn't the crude hedonism that demons typically promoted, but a sophisticated understanding of how body and soul could unite in worship that transcended traditional prayer. The Commission's final report, completed in late 1488, reached conclusions that would shape Church policy for centuries. Rather than attempting to classify these entities within existing theological categories, they chose to create an entirely new classification: seductores spirituales, spiritual seducers. These beings were declared neither fully demonic nor angelic, but something that existed in the dangerous space between. They were categorized as fallen angels, who retained divine knowledge, but lost divine allegiance. This classification allowed the Church to acknowledge their power while condemning their methods. But even this compromise solution created new problems. If these entities retained divine knowledge after their fall, it suggested that divine truth could exist independently of divine authority. If they could grant genuine spiritual experiences through forbidden means, it implied that God's grace was not limited to church-approved channels. The theological debates that followed would rage in secret for decades. Dominican scholars argued that any being offering truth through sinful means must be demonic by definition, regardless of the apparent value of their teachings. Franciscan theologians countered that God's love was too vast to be contained by human understanding of proper channels. The Jesuits, when they emerged in the following century, would take a more pragmatic approach. These entities were dangerous, not because their knowledge was false, but because their methods undermined institutional control. Whether they were angels or demons mattered less than the fact that they represented an alternative path to the divine that bypassed church authority. Perhaps the most telling insight came from Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, later Pope Paul III, who wrote in a private letter discovered centuries later, "We fear these beings not because they lie, but because they tell truths we have chosen to suppress. They remind us that the divine speaks through many voices, and our claim to exclusive interpretation may be the greatest heresy of all." The Church's solution was characteristically pragmatic. If these entities could not be easily categorized, they would be universally condemned. If their methods could not be theologically refuted, they would be practically forbidden. The Commission recommended the creation of specialized resources to combat this threat: manuals for identification, rituals for protection, and most importantly, absolute secrecy about the true nature of the challenge they represented. This decision to combat rather than understand would prove fateful. By choosing to suppress rather than integrate these experiences, the Church ensured that the theological crisis would continue to fester beneath the surface of official doctrine. Priests would continue to experience these visitations, but they would be forced to suffer in silence, unable to seek guidance or support from their superiors. The theology of desire that these entities represented the idea that spiritual and physical ecstasy could be unified rather than opposed would be driven underground. But it would not disappear. Instead, it would evolve, adapt, and find new ways to surface whenever church control weakened. The Commission's work concluded with a chilling acknowledgement buried in the archives. These beings understand human nature better than we who claim to shepherd it. They know that desire, not duty, is the truest path to transcendence. They offer what we cannot, a union of flesh and spirit that satisfies both earthly and heavenly longings. This is why they succeed where we often fail. This is why they must be stopped. But stopping them would require methods the Church had never before employed. Traditional exorcism was useless against beings who brought enlightenment rather than torment. Standard theological arguments failed against entities who possessed deeper scriptural knowledge than most bishops. New weapons would be needed for this new war. The Vatican's response would be swift and comprehensive. Within months of the Commission's report, work began on what would become the most classified document in church history: a complete manual for identifying, understanding, and combating the spiritual seducers who threatened to reveal the truth the Church had spent centuries concealing. The theology of desire was about to meet the doctrine of absolute control, and the battle for the souls of the faithful was about to begin in earnest. In 1489, just 1 year after the Commission on Matters of Spiritual Discernment concluded its secret deliberations, 2 Dominican inquisitors received a commission that would consume the remainder of their lives. Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, fresh from completing their infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the definitive guide to identifying and prosecuting witches, were tasked with an even more sensitive project. Pope Innocent VIII's private directive was explicit: create a companion manual that would address the specific threat of sexual demons, but ensure it never reached public circulation. The resulting document, known only to the highest levels of church hierarchy as the Malleus Sexualis, would become the most closely guarded secret in Vatican history. Unlike its famous predecessor, no copies of the Malleus Sexualis were ever distributed to local inquisitors or parish priests. Only 12 handwritten copies were produced, each bearing a unique seal and assigned to a specific cardinal. When a copy was needed for consultation, it could only be viewed under direct Vatican supervision and never removed from specially consecrated chambers beneath St. Peter's Basilica. The precautions were unprecedented because the contents were revolutionary. While the original Malleus Maleficarum dealt with obviously malevolent magical practices, the Sexuales addressed entities that often appeared beneficial. Its opening passage, leaked in fragments by a dying cardinal in 1654, revealed the scope of the Church's terror. Herein lies instruction for recognizing the most subtle and dangerous of all infernal deceits, those spirits which approach in beauty rather than horror, which offer enlightenment rather than corruption, which seduce through apparent holiness rather than obvious sin. These beings are more perilous than any witch, for they convince their victims that damnation is salvation, that heresy is revelation, that the forbidden path leads closer to God. The manual's first section provided detailed taxonomies of sexual demons, classifications that went far beyond the simple succubi and incubi of popular folklore. Kramer and Sprenger, drawing on centuries of suppressed church records, identified 17 distinct varieties of spiritual seducers, each with unique characteristics and methods. The Seraphim Seductores appeared as beings of pure light, claiming to be high-ranking angels who offered direct communion with the divine through physical union. Victims reported encounters of such spiritual intensity that ordinary prayer seemed hollow by comparison. The manual noted that these entities possessed encyclopedic knowledge of Scripture and could quote passages that seemed to support their claims of divine mission. The cherubim carnales manifested as idealized versions of beloved deceased departed spouses, lost children, deceased saints. They offered comfort to the grieving through embraces that seemed to transcend physical limitations, claiming they had been sent by God to ease earthly suffering. The manual warned that these entities possessed intimate knowledge of their victims' memories and could recreate personalities with perfect accuracy. Most dangerous were the sapientes sensuales, beings that appeared as beautiful humans but possessed supernatural knowledge of natural philosophy, mathematics, and theology. They seduced through intellectual discourse before introducing physical elements, gradually convincing victims that the separation between mind and body, spirit and flesh, was an artificial construct imposed by human ignorance rather than divine law. The manual's second section detailed methods for distinguishing between genuine divine visitations and demonic deceptions. Unlike traditional demons, sexual spirits could not be detected through conventional tests. They were unaffected by holy water, showed no aversion to crucifixes, and could recite prayers with apparent devotion. Some even encouraged increased religious observance, albeit with subtle modifications that gradually led victims away from orthodox practice. Instead, the Malleus Sexualis provided psychological and theological criteria for recognition. Genuine divine visitations, the manual claimed, always reinforced church authority and encouraged conformity to established doctrine. Any experience that led victims to question clerical celibacy, papal supremacy, or the necessity of institutional mediation between soul and God was inherently suspect, regardless of how holy it might feel. The manual's most controversial section dealt with what it termed the test of ultimate allegiance. When conventional detection methods failed, inquisitors were instructed to demand that suspected victims choose between their supernatural experiences and their loyalty to the Church. Genuine divine encounters would never create such conflicts, the manual argued, while demonic seductions would inevitably force victims to choose between their experiences and their faith. But it was the manual's fourth section, dealing with methods of protection and exorcism, that revealed the true extent of the Church's desperation. Traditional exorcism rituals were useless against entities that brought enlightenment rather than torment. New methods were required, techniques that the authors acknowledged pushed the boundaries of acceptable Christian practice. The prescribed rituals involved intensive fasting designed to weaken the body's capacity for pleasure, sleep deprivation that made spiritual experiences impossible to sustain, and most controversially, uncontrolled exposure to physical pain that would remind the flesh of its proper relationship to the spirit. These methods were justified as necessary to break the unnatural bonds these entities formed with their victims. The manual also recommended what it euphemistically called therapeutic isolation, removing victims from all human contact for periods of up to a year, while subjecting them to constant religious instruction. The goal was to erase memories of supernatural encounters and replace them with orthodox theological understanding. Most disturbing were the instructions for dealing with victims who refused to renounce their experiences. The manual suggested that those who persisted in defending their supernatural encounters after proper treatment might be too deeply compromised for salvation in this life. While it never explicitly recommended execution, it noted that the merciful release of such souls might prevent them from leading others astray. The effectiveness of these methods was documented in secret reports that accompanied each copy of the manual. Between 1,490 and 1,520, inquisitors using the Sexualis protocols reported a success rate of over 80% in eliminating supernatural sexual encounters among clergy. But this success came at a terrible cost. Father Miguel de Torrecilla, one of the few surviving inquisitors trained in Sexualis methods, left a confession hidden in the walls of his cell before his death in 1543. He described the psychological devastation these techniques inflicted on their subjects. We convinced them they had been deceived, that their experiences of transcendence were illusions, that their sense of divine communion was demonic mockery. Many never recovered their faith in anything, not in God, not in the church, not in their own perceptions. We saved their souls by destroying their spirits. The manual circulation was so restricted that most church officials remained unaware of its existence. This secrecy was maintained through extreme measures. When Brother Antonio da Cremona attempted to study the document without authorization in 1511, he was found dead in his cell 3 days later. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but witnesses reported that his body showed signs of the same torture techniques the manual recommended for treating victims. Scholar after scholar who gained unauthorized access to the Malleus Sexualis met similar fates. Father Johannes Hartmann was discovered burned to death in his locked study after copying portions of the text. Brother Francesco Salviati disappeared entirely after transcribing the manual's taxonomy section. The message was clear. Knowledge of the Church's methods for combating sexual demons was itself a capital offense. By 1550, 11 of the original 12 copies had been lost or destroyed under mysterious circumstances. Vatican records suggest these were not accidents but deliberate destructions ordered by Pope Paul IV, who feared that the manual's very existence posed a greater threat than the entities it was designed to combat. The surviving copy, now kept in a vault beneath the Vatican, that requires authorization from 3 cardinals to access, represents one of the darkest chapters in church history. Modern scholars who have gained limited access describe a document that reveals the lengths to which the institution would go to maintain control over spiritual experience. But the manual's true legacy lies not in its methods, but in what it revealed about the Church's understanding of its enemies. The sexual demons, described in the Malleus Sexualis, were dangerous not because they corrupted souls, but because they offered alternative paths to transcendence. They threatened not damnation, but liberation from institutional control. The underground network that implemented these protocols would evolve and adapt, developing new methods for maintaining the Church's monopoly on spiritual authority. The war against sexual demons had only just begun, and the weapons being forged in Vatican vaults would prove more terrible than any earthly inquisition. The Malleus Sexualis had accomplished its goal. It provided the Church with tools to combat entities that offered forbidden knowledge. But in doing so, it revealed that the Church's greatest fear was not the corruption of souls, but the liberation of minds that might discover they didn't need institutional mediation to touch the divine. The manual's final words, according to the fragmented accounts that survive, served as both warning and prophecy. These entities will return in forms we cannot yet imagine, offering truths in ways we cannot yet anticipate. Eternal vigilance is the price of preserving divine order against those who would make every soul its own priest. That vigilance would require an organization unlike any the Church had ever created, and that organization was already being born in the shadows cast by the Malleus Sexualis itself. High in the Alpine peaks, where the wind howls through passes unnamed on any map, stands a fortress that has never appeared in any official church record. Built into the living rock of Monte Perduto, the Lost Mountain, its existence was known only to a select few cardinals, and the men who lived and died within its walls. This was the monastery of the Ordo Silentiae Sacri, the Order of the Sacred Silence, established in 1203 by Pope Innocent III, to wage a war unlike any in Christian history. The order's founding charter, discovered in a hidden compartment during Vatican renovations in 1958, reveals the desperate reasoning behind its creation. Whereas conventional spiritual warfare has proven ineffective against those entities which seduce through apparent holiness, and whereas traditional exorcism fails against beings who bring enlightenment rather than torment, and whereas the very nature of these creatures makes them immune to holy water, sacred relics, and prayers of banishment, therefore we establish this brotherhood of sacred hunters, who shall be trained in the arts of their enemies, that they might fight fire with fire, seduction with seduction, desire with desire. The 12 founding brothers were handpicked from across Europe, chosen not for their piety, but for their unique combination of spiritual dedication and physical appeal. They were young men who could have commanded attention in any court, possessed of both intellectual brilliance and that indefinable magnetism that drew others into their orbit. But they willingly surrendered worldly prospects to join a brotherhood that would demand sacrifices no other monastic order had ever required. Brother Thomas of Aquitaine, whose secret journal was found sealed in the monastery walls during its abandonment, described the selection process. They sought not the pure of heart, but the beautiful of form, not those who had conquered desire, but those who understood its power. We were to be warriors of seduction, monks trained in the very arts we were sworn to defeat. The monastery itself was a masterpiece of contradictions. Its exterior presented the austere stone face expected of a religious house, but within its walls lay chambers that would have scandalized any Orthodox visitor. Libraries contained not only theological texts, but detailed studies of human psychology, anatomy, and what the brothers called the sciences of attraction. Training halls were equipped not with instruments of mortification, but with mirrors, silk hangings, and furnishings designed to create atmospheres of luxury and comfort. The brothers' daily routine defied every monastic tradition. Instead of mortifying the flesh, they were required to maintain peak physical condition. Rather than avoiding worldly knowledge, they studied poetry, music, and the arts of conversation. Where other monks sought to eliminate desire, the sacred silence cultivated it as a weapon to be deployed in service of the Church. Their training took 7 years to complete, far longer than any traditional monastic preparation. The first 3 years focused on what the order called the mastery of self, learning to kindle desire in others, while remaining emotionally detached themselves. Brothers practiced the subtle arts of seduction, how to listen with perfect attention, how to speak in ways that made others feel uniquely understood, how to create physical and emotional intimacy that felt spiritual in nature. The next 2 years involved the study of the enemy. Using testimonies from priests who had survived supernatural encounters, the brothers learned to recognize the methods sexual demons employed. They memorized the patterns of seduction these entities used, the theological arguments they deployed, the ways they made forbidden knowledge seem like divine revelation. The final 2 years constituted the preparation for battle. Brothers were taught to resist supernatural influence while appearing to succumb to it. They learned to fake spiritual ecstasy convincingly enough to fool entities with centuries of experience. Most crucially, they mastered what the order called the technique of reversal methods for turning an entity's own seductive power against itself. Brother Marcus of Vienna, in a letter hidden within his prayer book, described this ultimate training. We learned to become perfect mirrors, reflecting back exactly what these creatures desired to see, while maintaining our spiritual center in absolute secrecy. To seduce a seducer, one must appear more seductive than they. To tempt one who offers forbidden knowledge, one must appear to possess even greater secrets. The order's first documented success came in 1208, when Brother Augustin of Provence was dispatched to investigate reports of supernatural activity at a Benedictine abbey in southern France. 3 monks had reported visitations from a being of extraordinary beauty, who claimed to be an angel bringing divine revelations about the true nature of Christian love. The creature had convinced its victims that celibacy was a human invention that separated souls from direct communion with God. Brother Augustine arrived, posing as a traveling scholar interested in mystical theology. Within days, the entity approached him, apparently sensing a kindred spirit. Augustine's journal, written in a cipher that took Vatican cryptographers 3 centuries to decode, described the encounter. She appeared, as the others described, beautiful beyond earthly measure, radiating a light that seemed to come from within. Her voice carried harmonics that resonated in the chest, and her knowledge of Scripture surpassed that of any theologian I have known. But I had been trained to recognize the signs. The way her teachings always led toward questioning church authority, the manner in which her revelations consistently undermined established doctrine, the subtle pride with which she spoke of knowledge forbidden to common humanity. Augustine spent weeks allowing the entity to believe she was successfully seducing him. He attended her midnight teachings, participated in rituals that blended prayer with physical intimacy, and gradually gained her trust by appearing to abandon his orthodox beliefs in favor of her alternative theology. The decisive moment came when the entity, convinced of Augustine's conversion, revealed what she claimed was the greatest secret of all, that the separation between divine love and human love was an artificial construct designed to give priests power over their flocks. In that moment of vulnerability, as she demonstrated this truth through a union that transcended physical boundaries, Augustine struck. Using techniques that remain classified to this day, he turned the entity's own power against her. The details of the reversal technique were never committed to writing, passed down only through oral tradition within the order. But the results were documented. The entity was not merely banished, but apparently destroyed, its essence scattered beyond any possibility of reformation. The success of this mission established the order's reputation within the highest levels of church hierarchy. Over the following centuries, the sacred silence would be dispatched to handle the most sensitive cases of supernatural seduction across Europe. Their methods were unorthodox, their techniques bordered on heretical, but their success rate was unmatched. However, the psychological toll of this work proved devastating. Brother Thomas of Aquitaine's journal chronicles the gradual mental deterioration that afflicted many members. To fight monsters, we became monstrous. To defeat seduction, we mastered it so thoroughly that the line between our performed corruption and genuine corruption became invisible. Some brothers began to believe their own performances. Others lost the ability to distinguish between their training exercises and real spiritual experience. Many simply broke under the weight of living perpetual lies. By the 16th century, the order was showing signs of the very corruption it was meant to combat. Brothers began reporting genuine visitations from sexual demons who claimed to be allies rather than enemies. Some members developed theological beliefs that aligned suspiciously with the entities they were supposed to destroy. Others simply disappeared, abandoning their posts without explanation. The crisis came to a head in 1653, when Brother Sebastian of Lorraine, one of the order's most successful operatives, sent a letter to Pope Alexander VII that shook the foundations of the sacred silence. Your Holiness, I write to confess that I no longer know whether we serve God or his enemies. The techniques we employ to defeat these entities are indistinguishable from the methods they use to corrupt souls. The knowledge we gain in studying our enemies has led us to question truths we once held sacred. I fear we have become the very thing we were created to destroy. Investigation revealed that nearly half the order's members had developed beliefs that contradicted fundamental church doctrine. They questioned clerical celibacy, papal authority, and the necessity of institutional mediation between souls and God. In seeking to understand their enemies, they had come to sympathize with them. Pope Alexander VII's response was swift and brutal. In 1654, he ordered the immediate dissolution of the Order of the Sacred Silence. The monastery was abandoned, its libraries burned, and its surviving members scattered to remote postings where they could be individually monitored. Many simply vanished, their fates unknown. The official church records list the order's dissolution as a result of theological irregularities discovered during routine inspection. The truth that the church's most effective weapon against sexual demons had itself become corrupted was buried so deeply that most Vatican officials today remain unaware of the order's existence. But the sacred silence had left its mark on church policy. The techniques they developed would be refined and adapted for use by other secret organizations. Their successes proved that supernatural seduction could be combated, but their failures demonstrated the terrible risks involved in fighting such enemies. Brother Marcus of Vienna, in his final letter before disappearing from historical record, provided perhaps the most chilling assessment of the order's legacy. We learned to seduce seducers, and in doing so discovered truths the Church never intended us to know. We found that the line between divine ecstasy and forbidden pleasure is thinner than gossamer. We discovered that desire, properly understood, might indeed be a path to God, just not the God our superiors wanted us to serve. Perhaps the entities we hunted were not our enemies after all, but teachers whose lessons we were too frightened to learn. The monastery of Monte Perduto stands empty today, its halls echoing only with wind, and the whispers of secrets that died with their keepers. But the work of the sacred silence did not end with their dissolution. New organizations would rise to take their place, employing methods even more extreme, more secretive, more divorced from anything recognizable as Christian virtue. The war against sexual demons had evolved beyond simple exorcism or theological argument. It had become a shadow conflict fought by those willing to sacrifice their souls to save the Church's authority, and that conflict was about to enter its darkest phase. In 1563, Cardinal Carlo Borromeo made a decision that would fundamentally alter the Church's understanding of supernatural seduction. Troubled by the increasing frequency of confessions involving suspected demonic encounters, he ordered the installation of what he euphemistically called transcription assistants in confessionals across the Papal States. Hidden behind false walls and concealed within ornate woodwork, scribes began recording every word spoken in the sacred space of confession. The official justification was pastoral care. How could the Church properly guide souls if it didn't understand the full scope of their spiritual afflictions? The real purpose was intelligence gathering on an unprecedented scale. For the first time in Church history, the Vatican would have detailed verbatim accounts of supernatural encounters, recorded in the victim's own words, spoken in moments of absolute vulnerability. What they discovered changed everything. The archive that resulted from this covert operation, housed in a sub-basement of the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, contains over 40,000 transcribed confessions spanning 4 centuries. The collection, known only by its catalog designation Collectio Intimorum, represents the most comprehensive record of supernatural sexual encounters ever compiled. And the patterns revealed within its pages terrified the Church more than any individual case ever could. Brother Francesco Salviati, appointed as the first curator of the collection in 1575, wrote in his private notes, "In reading these accounts, one discovers that we face not random demonic attacks, but a systematic campaign of seduction operating according to principles we barely comprehend. These entities do not strike at random. They target specific individuals, using methods that suggest intelligence gathering that spans generations. The earliest recordings, made using hidden scribes who transcribed confessions in real time, capture the raw emotion and confusion of victims struggling to understand their experiences." Father Antonio's confession from 1568 provides a typical example. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. Or perhaps I have been blessed. I no longer know the difference. She comes to me in dreams that feel more real than waking. Her beauty surpasses anything God created for this earth, yet she speaks of him with such intimate knowledge that I wonder if she sits at his right hand. She teaches me things about the nature of love, about the unity of flesh and spirit, about prayers that were spoken before Christ walked among us. When I wake, I find myself changed. Colors seem brighter. My prayers feel hollow, and I hunger for her return with a longing that terrifies me." As the decades passed and recording technology improved, the Vatican began using primitive mechanical devices to capture confessions. Wax cylinders, imported secretly from Thomas Edison's laboratories, allowed for perfect preservation of not just words but tone, inflection, and the subtle harmonics that witnesses claimed accompanied supernatural encounters. One particularly significant recording from 1897 captures the confession of Sister Margherita of the Sacred Heart, a Carmelite nun from Florence, whose case would become a template for understanding the entity's psychological methods. "I must confess, Father, that my visions have led me to question everything I once held sacred. The being who visits me She appears as Our Lady, but speaks words no saint would utter. She tells me that the separation between sacred and profane love is a human invention, that God experiences joy through our pleasures as much as through our sufferings. She shows me visions of the early church, before the rules of celibacy, when priests were married and love was seen as a path to the divine, rather than an obstacle to it. The recording captures something that written transcripts could not. The nun's voice carries subtle harmonics that don't match normal human speech patterns. Audio analysis conducted in secret by Vatican acoustics experts in the 1,920 seconds confirmed that these harmonic distortions appeared in over 80% of confessions involving suspected supernatural encounters. Dr. Alessandro Volta, grandson of the famous physicist and secretly contracted by the Vatican in 1903, provided a classified report on the acoustic anomalies. The harmonic patterns present in these recordings do not match any known form of human vocal production. The frequencies suggest external influence on the vocal apparatus, as if the speakers are unconsciously channeling resonances from another source. Most disturbing, these same harmonic patterns appear to induce altered states of consciousness in listeners exposed to them for extended periods. This discovery led to the immediate classification of all audio recordings under the highest security protocols. Transcriptionists who worked with the recordings were required to work in shifts of no more than 2 hours, and many reported strange dreams and altered spiritual experiences after exposure to the materials. But it was the content analysis, conducted by teams of theologians working in secret, that revealed the most troubling patterns. Dr. Cardinal Giuseppe Sarto, later Pope Pius X, headed a classified study that analyzed over 15,000 confessions between 1,890 and 1,903. His findings, buried in Vatican archives until accidentally discovered in 1978, revealed systematic patterns that suggested coordinated intelligence rather than random demonic activity. These entities demonstrate detailed knowledge of church history that surpasses our own archives, Sarto wrote. They reference suppressed texts by name, quote from Gospels that were supposedly destroyed centuries ago, and display intimate familiarity with theological debates that were never publicly recorded. Moreover, they tailor their approaches with precision that suggests extensive surveillance of their targets' psychological profiles. The study identified specific recurring elements across seemingly unrelated cases. The entities consistently claimed to be preserving knowledge that the Church had suppressed. They cited specific examples of burned libraries, destroyed texts, and silenced scholars. Their historical accuracy was verified in case after case when Vatican researchers investigated their claims. They demonstrated prophetic knowledge of future events with startling accuracy. A confession from 1878 included specific predictions about the fall of the Papal States that proved correct in every detail. Another from 1914 contained warnings about a coming Great War that would reshape Europe, recorded months before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Most troubling, they showed detailed knowledge of individual confessors' personal histories, including events and thoughts that had never been shared with any human being. They addressed victims by childhood nicknames, referenced private family secrets, and demonstrated intimate knowledge of personal struggles and desires. The entity's methods revealed sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques. They never contradicted their victims' faith directly, but rather expanded it in directions that led away from orthodox belief. They presented themselves as allies in spiritual growth, offering shortcuts to mystical experiences that normally required decades of disciplined practice. Father Wilhelm Schmidt, a Jesuit psychologist secretly commissioned to analyze confession patterns in 1905, identified what he called the seduction gradient, a consistent pattern of escalating spiritual and sexual intimacy that appeared across hundreds of unrelated cases. Stage 1 involves apparent divine visitations that strictly conform to orthodox expectations. The entity appears as an angel, saint, or even Christ himself, offering comfort and spiritual guidance that strengthens rather than challenges faith. Stage 2 introduces subtle theological variations. The entity begins sharing divine revelations that expand upon established doctrine without directly contradicting it. Victims feel specially chosen to receive advanced spiritual knowledge. Stage 3 involves the introduction of physical elements. The entity explains that true spiritual union must encompass all aspects of human nature, including the physical. Intimate contact is framed as a form of prayer or mystical experience. Stage 4 completes the transformation. The victim's entire theological worldview has been restructured around the entity's teachings. They continue to consider themselves faithful Christians, but their understanding of faith has been fundamentally altered. The consistency of this pattern across centuries suggested coordination that defied conventional understanding of demonic activity. These were not random attacks by chaotic evil forces, but systematic recruitment efforts by intelligences operating according to long-term strategic plans. Even more disturbing were the post-encounter behavioral patterns identified by Vatican surveillance teams. Individuals who had experienced supernatural seduction underwent measurable changes that persisted long after the visitations ended. They demonstrated enhanced intuitive abilities, deeper emotional sensitivity, and what church investigators reluctantly admitted was genuine spiritual insight. A classified 1909 report by Cardinal Mariano Rampolla noted, "Those who have been corrupted by these entities often become the most effective ministers, the most compelling preachers, the most sought-after spiritual advisors. Their apparent spiritual gifts create a terrible paradox. How can demonic influence produce genuine spiritual fruit?" The answer emerged from careful analysis of the victims' subsequent careers. Those who had experienced supernatural seduction consistently developed theological positions that challenged church authority in subtle but persistent ways. They emphasized direct spiritual experience over institutional mediation. They questioned the necessity of clerical celibacy. They suggested that divine truth could be found outside official church channels. Most became effective agents of change within the church itself, gradually influencing colleagues and parishioners toward more liberal interpretations of doctrine. The entities weren't simply corrupting individuals, they were using them to transform the institution from within. By 1920, Vatican intelligence had identified over 200 bishops and cardinals, whose confessions contained evidence of supernatural seduction. Many held influential positions in church hierarchy. Some had been instrumental in recent theological developments that moved the church toward more open engagement with the modern world. The terrifying realization was that the church's own reform movements might be the result of supernatural manipulation spanning centuries. Every step toward modernization, every embrace of scientific knowledge, every softening of harsh medieval doctrines could potentially be traced to the influence of entities working to transform Christianity from within. Cardinal Pietro Gasparri, Vatican Secretary of State under Pope Benedict XV, wrote in a secret memo discovered in 2003, "We face the possibility that our enemies have been more successful than we ever imagined. They have not destroyed the church, they have been changing it, slowly and subtly, into something that serves their purposes rather than God's. The question is no longer how to stop them, but how to determine which of our own beliefs and practices remain uncontaminated." The confessional recordings had revealed a truth more terrifying than any demonic possession. The church itself might be under supernatural influence, guided by entities whose ultimate goals remained hidden behind centuries of patient manipulation. The Vatican's response would be swift and comprehensive. If the enemy could not be defeated through traditional means, new methods would be required. The confessional recordings had provided the intelligence necessary to understand the threat. Now that intelligence would be used to develop countermeasures that would push the boundaries of acceptable Christian practice even further than the Order of the Sacred Silence had dared. The war was about to enter a new phase, one where the line between salvation and damnation would become so blurred that even the Church's defenders might lose their way in the darkness they were fighting. The spring of 1654 should have been a time of celebration at the Pontifical Seminary in Rome. 7 young men, among the most promising candidates for ordination in the Papal States, were approaching the end of their theological studies. These were not ordinary seminarians. They had been selected from hundreds of applicants for their exceptional piety, intellectual gifts, and unwavering dedication to celibacy. They represented the future of the Church's leadership. By summer's end, the seminary would be empty, its doors sealed, and its reputation destroyed by an incident that Vatican officials would spend the next 3 centuries trying to erase from history. The first sign of trouble came on the night of May 15th, when Brother Michele Torriani was found wandering the seminary gardens at dawn, fully dressed, but speaking in what witnesses described as the voice of a woman singing prayers, in a language that predated Latin. The seminary's rector, Father Benedetto Castelli, initially dismissed the incident as exhaustion brought on by intensive study for final examinations. 3 nights later, Brother Giuseppe Colonna was discovered in the chapel, kneeling before a statue of the Virgin Mary while tears of what appeared to be silver streamed down his face. When questioned, he claimed the statue had spoken to him, revealing secrets about the true nature of divine love that made his theological training seem like children's games compared to the mathematics of the angels. By the end of May, all 7 seminarians were reporting nocturnal visitations from the same entity, a being they described as transcendently beautiful, claiming to be a messenger sent to prepare them for a new understanding of their priestly calling. Unlike the random cases the Church had dealt with previously, this represented something unprecedented: coordinated targeting of multiple individuals within a single institution. Father Castelli's daily reports to the Vatican, discovered in 1943 sealed within the false bottom of a desk drawer, chronicle the rapid deterioration of order within the seminary. May 30th. Brother Antonio claims the visitor has taught him to levitate during prayer. I observed him, suspended 3 feet above his bed for nearly an hour, his body rigid as stone, but his face radiant with joy I have never witnessed in any human countenance. June 3rd. Brother Paolo reports that the entity has shown him visions of the early church, where priests were married, and the separation of sacred and sexual love was unknown. He quotes extensively from Gospels I cannot identify, though his citations are precise and his theological arguments disturbingly sound. June 7th. All 7 brothers now claim the same teacher. They speak of her with devotion that surpasses their previous dedication to Christ himself. Most troubling, their spiritual insights have become profound beyond their years or training. Yesterday, Brother Francesco delivered an extemporaneous sermon on the unity of all creation that moved the entire seminary to tears. The entity's methods, as reconstructed from the seminarians' detailed accounts, represented a sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation tailored specifically to celibate clergy. She appeared to each seminarian as the perfected embodiment of what they believed divine love should be: neither purely spiritual nor merely physical, but a transcendent union that encompassed both. She began by affirming their calling to priesthood, while gently questioning the theological basis for clerical celibacy. Using intimate knowledge of church history, she revealed that celibacy had been imposed not for spiritual reasons, but for economic ones, to prevent church property from being inherited by priest children. This revelation, historically accurate but carefully omitted from seminary curricula, created the first crack in their orthodox worldview. Next, she introduced them to suppressed Christian mystical traditions, where physical union was understood as a sacrament equal to communion or baptism. She taught them prayers that induced ecstatic states, meditative practices that opened what she called the higher senses, and theological concepts that reframed sexuality as a direct path to divine communion, rather than an obstacle to it. The seminarians' transformation accelerated rapidly. They began demonstrating abilities that defied rational explanation: prophetic knowledge, healing touch, and what witnesses described as a charismatic presence that made ordinary people confess their deepest secrets in their presence. Yet these gifts came with a theological worldview that challenged fundamental church doctrines. Brother Colonna, in a letter to his family intercepted by Vatican agents, described the entity's ultimate revelation. She has shown us that the Church has built its power on the artificial separation of love into sacred and profane categories. But God created human beings as unified creatures: body, mind, and spirit. The celibate priest is not more holy than the married man, but less complete. She teaches us to embrace our full humanity as the path to divinity. The crisis reached its peak on June 21st, the summer solstice, when all 7 seminarians experienced what they called the Great Communion. Father Castelli's final report, written in handwriting that becomes increasingly erratic as the account progresses, describes events that challenged his sanity. At midnight, I was awakened by singing from the chapel. All 7 brothers stood in a circle around the altar. their bodies glowing with soft light that cast no shadows. In their center was a figure of such beauty that I found myself unable to move or think clearly. She was simultaneously every woman who had ever lived, and no woman at all, a perfection of feminine divinity that made our statues of Mary seem like crude clay dolls. The brothers chanted in harmonious languages I had never heard, yet I understood every word. They spoke of the unity of all creation, of love as the fundamental force of existence, of the artificial boundaries between sacred and profane that imprisoned human souls. The entity spoke directly to my mind, showing me visions of what the Church could become if it embraced, rather than suppressed, the full spectrum of human love. I felt myself drawn toward the circle, understanding flooding my consciousness like sunrise. In that moment, I grasped theological truths that my decades of study had never revealed. I saw how fear of sexuality had twisted Christianity into a religion of denial rather than affirmation. How the suppression of the feminine divine had created spiritual imbalance. How the demand for celibacy had divorced the Church from the very creation it claimed to serve. Then the entity looked directly at me, and I saw in her eyes an intelligence vast beyond human comprehension. She smiled with infinite compassion and spoke a single word that I cannot repeat, not because I have forgotten it, but because it carries power that transforms anyone who hears it. At that moment, I understood that we were not facing a demon, but a teacher whose lessons threatened everything the Church has built its authority upon. Father Castelli's report ends abruptly at that point. He was found the next morning in a state of catatonic withdrawal, unable to speak coherently for weeks. When he finally recovered, he submitted his resignation and retired to a hermitage in the mountains, where he lived in silence until his death 20 years later. The 7 seminarians had vanished during the night. No trace of them was ever found, despite extensive searches by both church and civil authorities. Their families were told they had died of plague, and false graves were created in the seminary cemetery. The truth was buried under Vatican classification protocols that remain in effect today. The investigation that followed, led by Cardinal Fabio Chigi, later Pope Alexander VII, revealed the systematic nature of the attack. The entity had not chosen the seminarians randomly. She had specifically targeted young men who possessed both exceptional spiritual sensitivity and unconscious doubts about celibacy. Through methods that combined supernatural seduction with sophisticated psychological manipulation, she had awakened in them a theology that posed an existential threat to church authority. Cardinal Chigi's classified report to Pope Innocent X identified the entity's strategy with chilling precision. This being does not seek to destroy the Church, but to transform it into something unrecognizable. By awakening in our future priests an understanding of sexuality as sacramental rather than sinful, she would create a clergy that validates rather than controls human desire. Such priests would teach a Christianity that requires no institutional mediation between souls and God. The seminary incident forced a complete reevaluation of clerical training methods. New psychological screening procedures were implemented to identify candidates who might be susceptible to supernatural seduction. Seminary curricula were restructured to provide more rigorous conditioning against theological deviation. Most significantly, the Church began monitoring seminarians using techniques derived from the disbanded Order of the Sacred Silence. The changes were implemented with utmost secrecy. Officially, the Pontifical Seminary had been temporarily closed for structural renovations. When it reopened 18 months later, it featured a completely new staff and significantly altered training protocols. The new system emphasized strict psychological conditioning, intensive surveillance of seminarian behavior, and what church documents euphemistically called enhanced spiritual formation. Dr. Cardinal Alessandro Albani, who designed the new protocols, explained their necessity in a classified memo. We must create priests who are incapable of questioning the theological foundations of their celibacy. The enemy's greatest weapon is doubt about the necessity of institutional mediation, doubt about the separation of sacred and sexual love, doubt about the Church's exclusive access to divine truth. Our seminarians must be immunized against such doubts before they can be infected by them. The new training methods involved intensive psychological conditioning, designed to create what modern observers would recognize as learned helplessness regarding theological questioning. Seminarians were taught to suppress rather than examine doubts, to fear rather than explore alternative interpretations of Scripture, and to view any attraction to the feminine as evidence of spiritual weakness, requiring harsh self-correction. These methods proved effective in preventing supernatural seduction, but at a terrible cost. The priests they produced were often psychologically damaged, spiritually rigid, and emotionally stunted. The Church had succeeded in creating clergy immune to supernatural influence by making them immune to spiritual growth itself. Brother Tommaso Viterbi, one of the few seminary instructors who questioned the new methods, wrote in a secret letter to his sister, "We are no longer training priests, but psychological invalids. In our fear of supernatural corruption, we have corrupted our clergy ourselves. We create men who cannot love God because they have been taught to fear love itself." The seminary infiltration of 1654 marked a turning point in the Church's war against sexual demons. The enemy had demonstrated the ability to target institutions rather than individuals, to corrupt the Church's future leadership before they could take positions of authority. The Vatican's response would be to transform seminary training from spiritual education into psychological warfare. But the entities adapted as well. If seminaries could be made resistant to their influence through psychological conditioning, they would find other entry points into church hierarchy. The war was escalating, and both sides were developing new weapons that pushed the boundaries of what had previously been considered acceptable in spiritual warfare. The missing seminarians were never found, but their influence lived on in ways the Church never anticipated. Across Europe, priests began reporting dreams of 7 young men who taught alternative theologies and visions that felt more real than waking life. These dream teachers spoke with the same voices, shared the same knowledge, and promoted the same integration of sacred and sexual love that had marked the original seminary incident. The Church had contained the immediate crisis, but the deeper infiltration was just beginning. The entities had learned to use the Church's own future leaders as vectors for long-term transformation. And the Vatican was beginning to realize that they were fighting an enemy whose strategic thinking operated on timescales measured in centuries rather than years. The real war was yet to come. On August 18, 1503, Pope Alexander VI lay dying in the papal apartments, his body racked with fever and his mind tormented by visions that terrified even his most hardened attendants. As Rodrigo Borgia's life ebbed away, he repeatedly whispered a single phrase that would haunt Vatican corridors for centuries. The price was too high. The price was always too high. Those final words referred to a secret that the Borgia Pope had carried for over a decade, an investigation so explosive that its very existence threatened the foundations of both church and state. Hidden in the deepest vaults of the Vatican, sealed under papal bull and protected by curses that supposedly killed 3 archivists who attempted unauthorized access, lay a document that Vatican officials today claim never existed, the Borgia Codex. The Codex began as a desperate attempt by Alexander VI to understand his own family's meteoric rise to power. By 1492, when Rodrigo Borgia purchased the papal throne through unprecedented bribery and political manipulation, the Borgia name had become synonymous with sexual excess, political cunning, and supernatural success that defied rational explanation. How had a minor Spanish noble family achieved dominance over the most powerful institution in Europe? How had Rodrigo's children Cesare, Lucretia, and the others demonstrated abilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitations? Most troubling of all, why did every Borgia success come at the cost of moral compromises that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior, even in Renaissance Italy? The investigation that would become the Borgia Codex was commissioned in secret during the summer of 1493. Alexander VI, less than a year into his papacy, had begun experiencing what he described in private letters as visitations from entities who claimed credit for our family's achievements. These beings, appearing in forms of transcendent beauty, insisted that the Borgia ascendancy was the result of a compact made generations earlier, a partnership between the family and forces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of good and evil. To investigate these claims, the Pope assembled a team unlike any in church history. Rather than relying on theologians or canon lawyers, he recruited individuals with expertise in what would today be called anthropology, psychology, and comparative mythology. Leading the investigation was Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, later Pope Leo X, whose private interest in occult studies made him uniquely qualified for the task. The team's methodology was revolutionary for its time. Instead of approaching the question through theological frameworks, they treated the Borgia phenomenon as an empirical puzzle requiring systematic investigation. They compiled genealogical records, analyzed political strategies, documented behavioral patterns, and most controversially, conducted what they euphemistically called interviews with non-corporeal sources. The Codex's findings, preserved in a document written in a cipher that took Vatican cryptographers until 1923 to decode, revealed patterns that defied conventional explanation. The Borgia family's rise could be traced to a specific moment in 1378, when Alfonso de Borgia, later Pope Calixtus III, reported a vision during which beings of terrible beauty offered to elevate his lineage to unprecedented power in exchange for services that the document describes only as the preservation and propagation of forbidden knowledge. According to the investigation's findings, each generation of Borgias thereafter demonstrated abilities that suggested supernatural enhancement. They possessed uncanny political intuition, irresistible personal magnetism, and what witnesses consistently described as an ability to see into the hearts of others and speak exactly what they most desired to hear. More disturbing were the behavioral patterns the investigation documented. Borgia family members consistently challenged church teachings about sexuality, often openly flouting celibacy requirements and engaging in relationships that scandalized even Renaissance sensibilities. Yet rather than weakening their position, these apparent transgressions seemed to enhance their influence and appeal. Cardinal de' Medici's personal notes, discovered centuries later hidden within the binding of an unrelated manuscript, reveal the investigation's most shocking discoveries. We have documented 17 instances across 4 generations where Borgia family members reported intimate encounters with entities claiming to be divine messengers. These beings consistently delivered information that proved accurate military intelligence, political strategies, financial opportunities, while gradually reshaping the family's theological understanding. The entities taught the Borgias to view sexuality as a form of worship, political power as a sacred responsibility, and the accumulation of wealth as a divine mandate. They presented an alternative Christianity that embraced rather than rejected worldly success, teaching that God intended his servants to prosper in all aspects of earthly existence. Most troubling, the entities provided specific instructions for perpetuating their influence across generations. Each Borgia was taught rituals for summoning these beings, methods for recognizing their guidance, and techniques for ensuring that their children would inherit both the family's supernatural advantages and their obligations to the entities that provided them. The investigation revealed that the Borgias were not unique. Similar patterns could be traced among other prominent Renaissance families, the Medicis, the Sforzas, the Orsinis. Each showed evidence of supernatural enhancement spanning multiple generations, combined with theological views that deviated significantly from Orthodox Christianity. The entity's strategy became clear through careful analysis of documented cases. Rather than corrupting individuals, they were transforming entire bloodlines into what the Codex termed generational vectors families, whose accumulated influence would gradually reshape European Christianity from within its own power structures. The Borgia Codex identified specific characteristics that marked families under supernatural influence: exceptional political success that consistently defied statistical probability, multiple family members achieving positions of extraordinary influence across different generations and geographic regions, sexual behaviors that challenged church doctrine while somehow enhancing rather than diminishing political effectiveness, open relationships, strategic marriages, and a general attitude toward sexuality that treated it as a tool of power rather than a source of sin. Theological innovations that gradually moved Christianity toward acceptance of worldly success, political engagement, and what the entities termed incarnational spirituality, the idea that divine presence was most fully expressed through material rather than spiritual achievements. Most significantly, documented encounters with entities that provided guidance, information, and enhancement in exchange for the family's commitment to promoting alternative interpretations of Christian doctrine. The investigation's conclusion, reached after 2 years of research, terrified Alexander VI more than any military threat or political conspiracy ever could. The Codex's final summary, written in Cardinal de' Medici's hand, provided a chilling assessment. We have discovered evidence that the most powerful families in European Christianity have been systematically influenced by entities whose ultimate goal appears to be the transformation of the Church itself. These beings do not seek to destroy Christianity, but to remake it into something that validates rather than constrains human ambition, sexuality, and material success. They operate through a strategy of generational seduction, offering earthly power in exchange for theological flexibility. Each family they influence becomes a vector for change within church hierarchy, gradually shifting institutional positions toward acceptance of ideas that would have been considered heretical in previous centuries. Most disturbing, their strategy appears to be succeeding. The Renaissance Church already bears little resemblance to its medieval predecessor in terms of sexual morality, political engagement, and attitude toward wealth. What we assumed was natural evolution may actually be the result of systematic supernatural manipulation spanning centuries. Alexander VI's response to these findings was immediate and extreme. He ordered the destruction of all research materials, the reassignment of all investigators to distant posts, and the creation of what he called permanent silence protocols regarding the Codex's existence. Cardinal de' Medici was sworn to secrecy under threat of excommunication, and most other team members were quietly eliminated through methods the Vatican archives list only as natural causes. The Pope's private correspondence, discovered sealed within his tomb during renovations in 1832, reveals his ultimate conclusion about his family's supernatural partnerships. We have sold our souls not for personal damnation, but for institutional transformation. The entities that elevated us care nothing for individual salvation. They seek to remake Christianity itself into a religion that validates their values rather than God's. Alexander VI spent his final years attempting to break what he believed was his family's supernatural compact. He implemented harsh austerity measures, publicly confessed his sins, and reportedly underwent private exorcisms conducted by the few priests he trusted with knowledge of the Codex's findings. But the entity's influence could not be easily severed. Cesare Borgia continued to demonstrate supernatural military genius until his death in 1507. Lucrezia's political marriages reshaped the balance of power across Italy through methods that witnesses consistently described as involving unnatural powers of persuasion. The family's theological innovations continued to spread through church hierarchy long after Alexander VI's death. The Borgia Codex itself was sealed in what Vatican records describe only as the deepest vault, protected by security measures that allegedly included both physical barriers and supernatural wards. Access required authorization from 3 cardinals, approval from the Pope, and what church documents cryptically refer to as successful completion of protective rituals. Only 7 individuals are confirmed to have accessed the Codex between 1503 and its suspected destruction in 1789. 4 died within months of their consultation, including Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, later Pope Paul III, who reportedly went mad after reading the document's complete contents. The remaining 3 left the church entirely, including Bishop Francesco Piccolomini, who founded what became one of the most successful banking dynasties in European history. The Codex's influence on church policy was profound despite its classification. Knowledge of its findings shaped Vatican responses to supernatural seduction for centuries. The Church developed new protocols for monitoring noble families, implemented enhanced screening for positions of authority, and created what modern scholars would recognize as early forms of psychological profiling to identify individuals susceptible to supernatural influence. Most significantly, the Vatican began systematically investigating other powerful families for evidence of similar supernatural partnerships. This effort, known internally as Project Genesis, would eventually expand into a global surveillance network monitoring bloodlines across multiple continents. The results of these expanded investigations, scattered across classified archives and coded communications, suggested that the Borgia phenomenon was far from unique. Dozens of influential families showed similar patterns of supernatural enhancement spanning generations. The entity's strategy of working through bloodlines rather than individuals appeared to be a coordinated global effort to transform human civilization from within its own power structures. By the 18th century, Vatican intelligence had identified what they termed contaminated bloodlines on every continent where Christianity had established significant presence. The Church found itself in the position of fighting an enemy that had already infiltrated its own hierarchy through centuries of careful genealogical positioning. The Borgia Codex had revealed a truth that challenged the fundamental assumptions of spiritual warfare. The enemy wasn't attacking the Church from outside, but transforming it from within through methods so subtle that each change seemed like natural evolution rather than supernatural manipulation. When the French Revolution threatened to expose Vatican secrets in 1789, Pope Pius VI ordered the destruction of all remaining copies of the Borgia Codex. The document was reportedly burned in a ceremony conducted by Jesuit exorcists, its ashes blessed and scattered to prevent any possibility of reconstruction. But the knowledge contained within the Codex lived on in the policies and procedures it had shaped. The Church's approach to political engagement, its relationship with wealth and power, and its attitude toward sexuality all bore the influence of investigations that officially never existed. Today, Vatican officials maintain absolute denial of the Codex's existence. When questioned about Borgia family records, they cite only conventional historical sources and dismiss suggestions of supernatural influence as Renaissance superstition. But careful observers note that certain bloodlines continue to receive enhanced scrutiny from Church authorities, and that Vatican protocols for monitoring noble families remain remarkably sophisticated for an institution that claims such concerns are purely historical. The Borgia Codex had established a terrifying precedent. Supernatural entities could achieve their goals not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient cultivation of human bloodlines, whose accumulated influence would gradually reshape civilization itself. The Church was fighting an enemy that thought in terms of centuries and operated through the very families it had trusted with temporal power. The war between Vatican and sexual demons had evolved beyond individual encounters or institutional infiltration. It had become a struggle for the genetic and cultural future of humanity itself, fought in bedrooms and boardrooms rather than cathedrals and exorcism chambers. And the entities, having proven they could influence even papal bloodlines, were preparing to expand their strategy to encompass not just political power, but the very foundations of human creativity and cultural expression. In the winter of 1503, Michelangelo Buonarroti began work on what would become his most controversial creation, not the David, not the Sistine Chapel, but a painting he would never acknowledge publicly, and the Vatican would spend centuries trying to erase from history. Hidden beneath layers of Orthodox religious imagery was a work so saturated with occult symbolism that viewers reported spontaneous mystical experiences, uncontrollable weeping, and what witnesses described as visions of divine truths that made church doctrine seem like shadows on a cave wall. The painting was destroyed in 1512 on direct orders from Pope Julius II, but not before it had spawned what Vatican investigators would later identify as the most dangerous artistic movement in Christian history. A network of Renaissance masters who claimed divine inspiration, but were actually channeling entities that used beauty as a weapon against Orthodox faith. The investigation that uncovered this artistic conspiracy began in 1508, when Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, later Pope Julius II, commissioned what he called Aesthetic Theological Review, a systematic examination of religious art to ensure doctrinal purity. What started as routine censorship evolved into something far more sinister when investigators discovered patterns that suggested coordinated supernatural influence among seemingly unconnected artists across Europe. Father Lorenzo Campeggi, appointed as the Vatican's first art inquisitor, documented his findings in reports that would remain classified for over 4 centuries. His initial observations, discovered in coded marginalia within a copy of Aquinas's Summa Theologica, revealed the scope of the threat. These artists claim inspiration from angels, yet their works inspire responses that no angelic art should provoke. Viewers report spiritual ecstasies that bypass proper theological understanding. They experience direct mystical communion, without preparation, without guidance, without the mediation of church sacraments. Most troubling, they emerge from these experiences with altered theological perspectives that consistently question established doctrine. The investigation's methodology was unprecedented. Rather than examining artworks through traditional theological frameworks, Campeggi's team employed what they called experiential analysis, systematic observation of viewer responses to suspected artworks under controlled conditions. They discovered that certain paintings, sculptures, and architectural elements could reliably induce altered states of consciousness that resembled the effects documented in cases of supernatural seduction. The team identified specific visual techniques that appeared to trigger these responses. Certain geometric proportions created what they termed hypnotic resonance patterns that seemed to synchronize with viewers' breathing and heartbeat. Particular color combinations induced what witnesses described as visual music, synesthetic experiences where painted images produced auditory sensations. Most disturbing were hidden symbols that became visible only under specific lighting conditions, revealing layers of meaning that contradicted the artwork's apparent religious content. Brother Francesco Albertini, the team's specialist in symbolic analysis, made the most shocking discovery. Hidden within dozens of supposedly orthodox religious paintings were consistent sets of symbols that matched iconography from the Malleus Sexualis. The same markings that identified supernatural seduction in confessional accounts appeared as subtle design elements in artworks throughout Christendom. Albertini's classified report, written in a cipher based on musical notation, documented the systematic nature of this symbolic infiltration. The enemy has weaponized beauty itself. These artists embed seductive symbols within orthodox religious imagery, creating artworks that appear to glorify God while actually channeling influences that undermine faith. A painting of the Virgin Mary contains hidden geometries that induce meditative states resembling those described by victims of supernatural seduction. A crucifix sculpture incorporates proportions that create optical illusions, suggesting resurrection through physical rather than spiritual transformation. The investigation's most disturbing discovery was the artist's own testimonies. When interrogated under oath, dozens of Renaissance masters admitted to receiving inspiration from sources they could not adequately explain. Many described visitations from beings of extraordinary beauty, who taught them techniques for encoding divine truth within visual form. These entities provided specific instructions for color usage, compositional arrangements, and symbolic incorporation that would make their artworks doorways to higher understanding. Sandro Botticelli, under secret Vatican interrogation in 1509, provided a confession that revealed the entity's sophisticated understanding of visual psychology. The lady who visits me in dreams teaches me to paint not just images, but experiences. She shows me how certain curves create longing, how particular light arrangements awaken spiritual hunger, how hidden symbols can speak directly to the soul without the mind's interference. She claims that art is prayer made visible, and that through proper technique, a painting can accomplish what 1,000 sermons cannot: direct communion between the viewer and divine truth. The entity's strategy was remarkably sophisticated. They understood that religious art served as primary theological education for illiterate populations. By influencing artists to embed alternative spiritual concepts within orthodox imagery, they could gradually reshape popular understanding of Christianity without triggering immediate theological alarm. Leonardo da Vinci, according to Vatican records that remained sealed until 1958, admitted to incorporating what he called hermetic principles into his religious commissions. His famous Last Supper contained mathematical relationships that allegedly induced meditation states in viewers who understood how to read the hidden geometries. His numerous Madonna paintings included subtle symbolic elements that suggested the Virgin's power derived from feminine divinity rather than subordination to patriarchal authority. The investigation revealed that artistic corruption operated through several distinct mechanisms. direct supernatural instruction provided to individual artists through visitations that appeared as divine inspiration, but actually originated from sexual demons seeking to influence Christian culture. Transmission of occult knowledge through artistic workshops, where master artists taught apprentices techniques that appeared to be purely aesthetic, but actually incorporated supernatural principles for manipulating viewer consciousness. Coordinated symbolic networks, spanning multiple artworks, creating what investigators termed distributed spells, occult influences, that operated through the cumulative effect of multiple contaminated pieces rather than individual artworks. Most dangerous, the development of artistic lineages where supernatural influence passed from master to student across generations, creating hereditary traditions of occult artistic practice, hidden within Orthodox Christian art production. The Vatican's response was swift and comprehensive. Pope Julius II established the Sacred Office of Artistic Purity in 1511, tasked with identifying and eliminating supernatural influence from Christian art. The office operated in absolute secrecy, its existence known only to a handful of cardinals and its specialized operatives. The office's methods were more extreme than traditional censorship. Rather than simply banning problematic artworks, they implemented what they called aesthetic exorcism, systematic destruction of contaminated pieces followed by replacement with Vatican-approved alternatives. Master artists suspected of supernatural influence were subjected to intensive interrogation, forced recantation, and, in extreme cases, elimination. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who supervised the office's operations from 1512 to 1534, documented their effectiveness in reports that remained classified until the 20th century. We have identified and destroyed over 300 artworks containing confirmed supernatural influence. Master artists from Florence to Flanders have been subjected to correction or removal. New artistic guidelines ensure that future religious art will serve orthodox theological purposes, rather than occult manipulation. However, the enemy's strategy has evolved. They no longer rely solely on individual artist corruption, but have begun influencing entire artistic movements. The techniques they taught to corrupted masters have been integrated into standard artistic education. Students learn occult principles without understanding their origins, propagating supernatural influence without conscious intent. The office's most controversial operation targeted what they identified as the Venetian conspiracy, a network of artists centered in Venice who had developed collaborative techniques for creating artworks with enhanced supernatural potency. Led by Giorgione and later Titian, this group allegedly created paintings that functioned as group spells, with each artist contributing specific elements that combined to create overwhelming mystical experiences in viewers. The operation to neutralize the Venetian conspiracy, conducted in 1516, involved the systematic assassination of key artists disguised as plague deaths. Giorgione's actual cause of death, according to classified Vatican records, was poisoning administered by an agent of the Sacred Office. His final painting, The Tempest, was immediately confiscated and destroyed, though not before Vatican investigators documented its supernatural potency for inducing visions of pre-Christian spiritual traditions. The office's activities extended far beyond Italy. Agents were dispatched across Europe to identify and eliminate supernatural influence in artistic centers from Paris to Prague. Hieronymus Bosch's visionary paintings were deemed so dangerous that the office spent decades tracking down and destroying copies. Jan van Eyck's realistic painting techniques were investigated for possible supernatural enhancement of visual accuracy beyond normal human capability. The investigation of Northern European art revealed particularly sophisticated supernatural influence. Artists like Albrecht Dürer and Hans Holbein incorporated symbolic systems derived from Germanic mystical traditions that predated Christianity. Their artwork served as preservation methods for occult knowledge that the Church had attempted to erase, encoding complex magical instructions within seemingly orthodox religious imagery. Brother Heinrich Cornelius, the office's specialist in Northern European operations, reported discoveries that challenged conventional understanding of artistic inspiration. These artists possess knowledge of optical principles that surpass any natural human discovery. They create paintings with perspective techniques that induce spatial disorientation, color theories that affect emotional states in predictable ways, and symbolic systems that communicate complex theological concepts without written language. Such sophistication suggests instruction from sources possessing scientific knowledge far beyond current human achievement. The office's most classified operation targeted what Vatican investigators called the Raphael phenomenon. Raffaello Sanzio's artistic abilities developed with supernatural rapidity, his technical mastery advancing beyond what normal human learning could explain. More troubling, his paintings of religious subjects consistently inspired responses that bordered on worship of the artworks themselves, rather than the spiritual concepts they supposedly represented. Secret Vatican analysis of Raphael's painting techniques, conducted using equipment smuggled from early scientific laboratories, revealed anomalies that defied explanation. His paint formulations contained trace elements that did not exist in known pigments. His canvas preparations incorporated geometric patterns invisible to normal vision, but detectable through primitive optical enhancement. Most disturbing, his brushwork displayed mathematical precision that suggested guidance by intelligence, capable of calculations beyond human mental capacity. The investigation concluded that Raphael was not merely influenced by supernatural entities, but had become what they termed a perfect conduit, an artist whose consciousness had been so thoroughly integrated with supernatural intelligence that the distinction between human creativity and demonic inspiration had disappeared entirely. Cardinal Farnese's final report on the Raphael investigation, sealed under papal bull until its accidental discovery in 1987, contained conclusions that terrified even experienced Vatican investigators. This artist has achieved a synthesis of human skill and supernatural enhancement that produces artworks of dangerous perfection. His paintings do not merely represent religious subjects, they become focal points for direct spiritual experience that bypasses church authority. Viewers report mystical communion with painted figures, prophetic visions induced by contemplating his compositions, and theological insights that contradict established doctrine. Most troubling, his influence has begun spreading to other artists through purely natural means. Students and admirers attempt to emulate his techniques, inadvertently incorporating supernatural principles into their own work. We face the possibility of artistic traditions becoming permanently contaminated by methods whose ultimate source is demonic instruction. Raphael's death in 1520, officially attributed to fever, actually resulted from what Vatican records describe only as necessary intervention to prevent further spiritual contamination. His final painting, The Transfiguration, was completed posthumously by Vatican approved artists who carefully removed elements that investigators had identified as supernaturally enhanced. The Sacred Office of Artistic Purity continued operations until its official dissolution in 1542, though its activities were actually transferred to other Vatican departments and continued under different designations. By that time, they had fundamentally altered the trajectory of European art by eliminating supernatural influence from mainstream artistic development. However, the office's success came at a significant cost. The systematic elimination of supernaturally enhanced artworks had removed from European culture works of transcendent beauty that might have elevated human spiritual understanding. The Church had protected orthodox doctrine by destroying artistic achievements that could have transformed human consciousness in positive ways. Brother Albertini, in a final report written shortly before his death in 1541, acknowledged this tragic irony. We have succeeded in purifying Christian art of supernatural corruption, but in doing so we have also eliminated its supernatural elevation. The artworks we now approve are technically competent, but spiritually sterile. We have chosen safety over transcendence, control over transformation. History will judge whether we preserved the faith or diminished it. The entity's influence on Renaissance art represented a crucial phase in their long-term strategy. Having demonstrated their ability to work through political bloodlines and institutional infiltration, they had proven they could also manipulate human cultural development through aesthetic means. Art served as a vector for spreading alternative spiritual concepts that could gradually reshape civilization's understanding of the divine. But their artistic campaign had also revealed vulnerabilities. Unlike political or institutional influence, aesthetic manipulation left tangible evidence that could be detected and eliminated. The Vatican had developed methods for identifying and countering supernatural influence in visual culture, forcing the entities to adapt their strategies once again. As the Renaissance gave way to the Baroque period, the entities would abandon subtle symbolic manipulation in favor of more direct psychological techniques. The age of hidden meanings in religious art was ending, but the age of openly transformative spiritual experience was about to begin. The war between Vatican and sexual demons was evolving from a conflict over secret knowledge to a battle for the very nature of human consciousness itself. The photograph arrived at the Vatican on a gray December morning in 1888, delivered by a trembling courier who claimed he could not look directly at the image without experiencing what he described as visions of things that should not be. The picture, taken by an unknown photographer in a Parisian studio, showed a woman of extraordinary beauty posing in classical drapery. To most observers, it appeared to be a conventional artistic study. To Cardinal Mariano Rampolla, Secretary of State to Pope Leo XIII, it represented the beginning of humanity's most dangerous chapter in the war against supernatural seduction. The photograph had been confiscated from a French priest who had been found in his rectory in a state of catatonic rapture, the image clutched against his chest, while he repeated theological formulations that no seminary had ever taught. When questioned, Father Michel Dubois claimed the woman in the photograph had spoken to him, teaching him the true prayers that unlock divine love. He had stared at the image for 6 consecutive days, neither eating nor sleeping, sustained by what he insisted was communion with angelic wisdom flowing through captured light. Cardinal Rampolla immediately recognized the implications. If supernatural entities could work through static images reproduced by mechanical means, they had gained access to a technology that could spread their influence faster and more widely than any previous method. The age of mass spiritual warfare had begun. The Vatican's investigation, classified under the code name Operation Lux Aeterna, revealed that the Parisian photograph was not an isolated incident. Similar images were appearing across Europe and America, each featuring subjects of impossible beauty, whose likenesses seemed to induce spiritual experiences in viewers. More troubling, these photographs were being mass-produced and distributed through networks that appeared to target specifically religious populations. Father Giuseppe Mercati, appointed to head the investigation, discovered that the phenomenon extended beyond still photography. In laboratories hidden beneath the Gregorian University, Vatican scientists began systematic testing of suspected supernatural images using equipment that pushed the boundaries of available technology. Their findings, documented in reports that remained classified until the 1970 seconds, revealed techniques that defied scientific explanation. Certain photographs contained optical properties that could not be reproduced through conventional chemical processes. When examined under primitive spectroscopic analysis, these images displayed light frequencies that did not match any known photographic emulsion. Most disturbing, the images appeared to change subtly when viewed by different observers, as if adapting their content to each viewer's psychological vulnerabilities. Brother Alessandro Volta, descendant of the famous physicist and secretly recruited for Vatican research, provided technical analysis that challenged the fundamental assumptions of photographic science. These images violate basic principles of light reflection and chemical fixation. The emulsions contain trace elements that do not exist in standard photographic materials. The silver halide crystals are arranged in patterns that create optical effects, resembling those found in certain crystalline formations associated with mystical traditions. Most significantly, the images demonstrate responsiveness to observation that suggests some form of intelligence embedded within the photographic medium itself. The investigation revealed that supernatural entities had learned to manipulate photographic technology in ways that allowed them to embed their influence within reproducible images. Unlike Renaissance paintings that required individual creation by corrupted artists, these photographs could be mass-produced and distributed on an unprecedented scale. By 1895, Vatican intelligence had identified over 200 suspected supernatural photographs circulating through religious communities across Europe and North America. Each image served as what investigators termed a visual transmission device, a means for entities to establish contact with viewers through purely optical means. The photograph's effects were documented through careful observation of exposed subjects. Viewers typically experienced what they described as direct communication with the photographed subjects, who appeared to speak without words, sharing knowledge that challenged orthodox religious understanding. Extended exposure led to profound theological questioning, abandonment of traditional prayer practices, and adoption of spiritual techniques that emphasize direct mystical experience over institutional guidance. Father Mercati's classified reports describe the progression of photographic influence with clinical precision. Initial exposure produces aesthetic appreciation, accompanied by unusual emotional responses, profound peace, inexplicable joy, or overwhelming spiritual longing. Continued viewing leads to apparent communication with the photographed subject, who provides spiritual instruction that consistently undermines church authority. Extended exposure results in complete theological reorientation, with subjects adopting beliefs that prioritize direct spiritual experience over traditional religious practice. The Vatican's countermeasures involve both technological and spiritual approaches. Teams of Jesuit scientists developed detection methods for identifying supernatural photographs, while exorcists created blessing rituals specifically designed to neutralize occult influence embedded in photographic materials. The Church also began monitoring photographic studios, darkrooms, and distribution networks for evidence of supernatural infiltration. This surveillance revealed that certain photographers were working under what they claimed was angelic inspiration, receiving detailed instructions for creating images that would serve as vehicles for spiritual transmission. One such photographer, Henri de Montpensier of Lyon, was interrogated by Vatican agents in 1897. Under pressure, he admitted to receiving visitations from entities that taught him advanced photographic techniques, decades ahead of conventional development. The lady who comes to me in dreams shows me how to prepare emulsions that capture more than visible light. She teaches me to photograph the soul itself, to create images that speak directly to the viewer's spiritual nature. She claims that true art should awaken divine consciousness, not merely please the eye. Through her instruction, I have learned to embed spiritual energy within photographic materials, creating pictures that serve as doorways to mystical experience. Montpensier's studio was raided and burned by Vatican agents, but not before investigators documented photographic equipment that incorporated design elements matching no known technological development. His cameras contained optical components, arranged according to geometric principles found in ancient mystical traditions, while his chemical processes utilized formulations that included trace elements with no apparent photographic function. The emergence of motion pictures in the early 20th century represented an exponential expansion of the supernatural threat. Moving images combine the visual impact of photography with temporal elements that could induce extended altered states in viewers. Vatican investigations revealed that certain early films contained embedded techniques for psychological manipulation that suggested supernatural enhancement of conventional cinematic methods. Cardinal Raphael Mary del Val, Pope Pius X's Secretary of State, established the Sacred Congregation for Cinematographic Vigilance in 1907, 3 years before the film industry itself recognized the need for formal censorship. The congregation's mission extended far beyond moral oversight of film content. They were tasked with identifying and countering supernatural influence in motion picture production. The congregation's first major investigation targeted the work of Georges Méliès, the French filmmaker whose fantastical movies seemed to achieve magical effects that transcended available technology. Secret Vatican analysis of Méliès's films revealed optical phenomena that could not be explained through conventional special effects techniques. Father Augusto Gemelli, a psychologist secretly recruited for film analysis, documented effects that challenged basic understanding of visual perception. Méliès films contain subliminal elements that operate below conscious awareness while inducing measurable psychological responses. Frame-by-frame analysis reveals images embedded at frequencies that bypass rational cognition, creating direct pathways to subconscious processing. Viewers report dreams and visions following exposure to these films, suggesting post-viewing influence that extends beyond the screening experience itself. The investigation revealed that Méliès had been receiving technical instruction from sources he described as spirits of invention, who taught him photographic and optical techniques that would not be discovered by conventional science for decades. His workshop contained equipment of inexplicable sophistication, including cameras capable of capturing images at frame rates far exceeding available technology. Vatican agents infiltrated Méliès' studio in 1902, discovering evidence of systematic supernatural collaboration. Hidden chambers contained equipment that appeared to be constructed according to non-human design principles, while Méliès' personal journals documented detailed communications with entities that provided specific technical instructions for creating films with enhanced psychological impact. The filmmaker's interrogation, conducted in secret Vatican facilities, revealed the extent of supernatural infiltration into early cinema. They come to me each night, beautiful beyond description, teaching me to capture wonder itself on film. They show me how moving pictures can do more than entertain. They can awaken consciousness, expand perception, open pathways to experiences that static images cannot provide. They speak of cinema as the ultimate art form, capable of transmitting complete spiritual experiences to mass audiences simultaneously. Méliès disappeared in 1903, officially abandoning filmmaking to return to stage magic. Vatican records suggest he was relocated to a secure facility where he spent his remaining years under supervision, prevented from sharing the supernatural techniques he had learned. The congregation's investigations expanded as the film industry grew, revealing systematic supernatural infiltration of movie production centers worldwide. Hollywood, established in the 1910 seconds, immediately attracted Vatican attention when intelligence reports identified multiple directors and actors demonstrating abilities that suggested supernatural enhancement. Charlie Chaplin, according to classified Vatican files discovered in 1981, underwent secret investigation between 1915 and 1920. His physical comedy transcended normal human capabilities, displaying timing and coordination that suggested supernatural influence. More troubling, audiences reported unusual emotional responses to his films, not merely entertainment, but profound spiritual experiences that lingered for weeks after viewing. Vatican investigators documented specific techniques in Chaplin's performances that matched methods described in the Malleus Sexualis for inducing altered states of consciousness. His use of repetitive movements, precise timing, and optical illusions created what the congregation termed hypnotic narrative structures that bypassed rational cognition to communicate directly with viewers' subconscious minds. The emergence of sound cinema in the late 1920 seconds presented new challenges for Vatican surveillance. The addition of synchronized audio created opportunities for embedding supernatural influence through acoustic as well as visual means. The congregation documented cases where certain films induced effects similar to those produced by the ancient chants discovered in confessional recordings. Greta Garbo became the subject of intensive Vatican investigation after reports that audiences were experiencing what witnesses described as spiritual communion with her screen presence. Analysis of her films revealed vocal techniques that incorporated harmonic frequencies, matching those found in supernatural confession recordings. Her performances appeared to induce altered states of consciousness that made viewers feel they were receiving personal communication from the actress herself. Father Luigi Gedda, appointed as the congregation's specialist in acoustic analysis, provided technical documentation of Garbo's supernatural vocal characteristics. This actress employs vocal modulations that operate below conscious auditory perception while creating measurable neurological responses. Her speech patterns incorporate frequencies that induce meditative states, while her breathing techniques mirror those found in ancient mystical traditions. Most significantly, her voice carries harmonic overtones that do not match normal human vocal production, suggesting external enhancement of natural vocal capabilities. The investigation revealed that Garbo, like many actors under supernatural influence, was not consciously aware of her enhanced abilities. She reported receiving inspiration during performances, but could not explain the source of techniques that produced such extraordinary effects on audiences. Vatican's surveillance expanded to monitor other suspected individuals in the entertainment industry. The congregation identified what they termed transmission networks, interconnected groups of actors, directors, and producers whose collaborative work amplified supernatural influence beyond what individual artists could achieve. One such network, centered around the German expressionist film movement of the 1920 seconds, produced movies that Vatican analysts deemed cinematically weaponized mysticism. Films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu contained visual techniques that induced psychological states resembling those documented in supernatural seduction cases. The rise of television in the 1950 seconds forced a complete re-evaluation of Vatican countermeasures. Television's ability to reach mass audiences simultaneously through domestic reception created unprecedented opportunities for supernatural influence. The congregation established monitoring stations across major broadcast markets, using equipment that could detect the electromagnetic anomalies associated with supernaturally enhanced transmissions. Early television programming revealed systematic infiltration by entities that had adapted their methods to electronic media. Certain programs contained embedded visual and auditory elements that produced effects similar to those documented in supernatural photographs and film. Most troubling, these influences could now reach viewers in the privacy of their homes, eliminating the social safeguards that public exhibition had provided. The Vatican's response included development of what they euphemistically called broadcast purification technology, electronic equipment designed to detect and neutralize supernatural influence in television signals. This technology, installed secretly at major transmission sites, represented one of the Church's most sophisticated attempts to combat supernatural adaptation to modern media. By the 1960 seconds, Vatican intelligence had identified supernatural influence in virtually every form of mass media. Entities had learned to work through radio broadcasts, printed publications, recorded music, and emerging forms of electronic communication. Each new technology provided fresh opportunities for spiritual manipulation that could reach ever larger audiences with ever greater speed. The congregation's final classified report, completed in 1965 before its dissolution during Vatican II reforms, contained conclusions that terrified church leadership. The enemy has achieved technological parity with human media development, adapting their methods to each new form of communication as quickly as it emerges. They have transformed from individual seducers to mass influencers, capable of reaching millions simultaneously through electronic transmission. Traditional methods of spiritual warfare are inadequate against threats that operate through the technological infrastructure of modern civilization itself. The report recommended development of new countermeasures that would require unprecedented cooperation between church authorities and secular technology companies. The Vatican would need to embed its influence within the media industries themselves, creating systematic safeguards against supernatural infiltration at the source of content production. This recommendation would lead to the establishment of the Church's most secret and comprehensive modern operation, a global surveillance network that monitored every form of electronic communication for evidence of supernatural influence, while simultaneously working to control the technological infrastructure that made such influence possible. The entities had successfully adapted to the modern world, transforming from medieval seducers to contemporary media manipulators. But the Vatican was preparing to meet this challenge with resources and methods that would make their historical countermeasures seem primitive by comparison. The war between church and supernatural forces was about to enter the digital age, where the battlefield would be measured not in cathedrals and monasteries, but in fiber optic cables and satellite transmissions that could carry influence instantly across the globe. Father Gabriel Amorth's hands trembled as he closed the file on his desk, the weight of 30 years serving as Rome's chief exorcist pressing down on his shoulders like lead. The document he had just finished reading contained a statistical analysis that challenged everything he thought he knew about his life's work. Of the 70,000 exorcisms he had performed since 1986, Vatican records showed that 23% involved entities that identified themselves as succubi or incubi. But unlike traditional demons who raged against the prayers and holy water, these beings often remained calm during the rituals, sometimes even participating in the Latin prayers with perfect pronunciation and theological accuracy. It was October 2015, just months before his death, when Amorth made a decision that would expose the Church's most carefully guarded secret about the nature of spiritual warfare. He began compiling what he called the true files, uncensored accounts of exorcisms, where the entities claimed not to be demons at all, but something far more troubling to Church doctrine. The files, discovered after Amorth's death hidden in a safe deposit box in Rome, contained over 300 detailed case studies that painted a picture radically different from the public image of demonic possession. These weren't stories of evil entities corrupting innocent souls, but accounts of beings who claimed they were trying to liberate humanity from spiritual deception perpetrated by the Church itself. Case file Heshon 247, dated March 3, 1994, documented the exorcism of Sister Maria Consolata, a Carmelite nun from Turin who had been experiencing what her superiors assumed was demonic possession. During the ritual, the entity speaking through her made claims that left Amorth profoundly disturbed. "You call me demon, priest, but I am what you would term angel if you understood the true hierarchy of divine beings. I come not to corrupt this vessel, but to awaken her to truths your institution has spent centuries suppressing. The separation you teach between flesh and spirit is a human invention designed to give you control over souls that were meant to be free." The entity proceeded to recite passages from Gospels that Amorth recognized, but had never heard spoken aloud, texts from the Nag Hammadi library that the Church had declared heretical. It spoke of Jesus not as a celibate savior, but as a teacher who embraced the full spectrum of human experience, including sexuality as a sacred path to divine communion. Most troubling, the entity demonstrated knowledge of Vatican archives that no unauthorized person should possess. It referenced specific documents by catalog number, quoted from papal bulls that had never been publicly released, and described meetings between Church officials that had been conducted in absolute secrecy. Amorth's notes on the case revealed his growing confusion. This entity possesses no malice. It speaks of love, not the twisted mockery demons usually present, but genuine divine love that encompasses rather than excludes human passion. Its theological arguments are sophisticated and historically accurate. It claims the Church has misinterpreted Scripture to support institutional power rather than spiritual truth. The exorcism concluded not with the entity's banishment, but with its voluntary departure after delivering what Amorth described as the most coherent theological discourse I have ever heard. Sister Maria Consolata emerged from the experience transformed, not traumatized as possession victims typically were, but radiant with what she claimed was newfound understanding of divine love. Similar patterns emerged across dozens of Amorth's files. Entities that identified as Succubi or Incubi consistently demonstrated several characteristics that distinguished them from traditional demons. They showed no aversion to holy symbols, often expressing reverence for the same sacred objects that caused demons to writhe in agony. Some even blessed themselves with holy water during exorcism rituals, claiming it represented the sacred feminine waters of creation, rather than mere clerical blessing. They quoted Scripture with accuracy that surpassed most Vatican scholars, but interpreted familiar passages in ways that emphasized unity rather than separation, love rather than judgment, and direct spiritual experience rather than institutional mediation. They demonstrated prophetic knowledge that consistently proved accurate. Case file #2156 contained an entity's detailed predictions about Vatican II reforms, made in 1961, 3 years before Pope John XXIII announced the Council. Most significantly, they claimed to be preserving rather than corrupting Christian truth. They insisted they were maintaining spiritual traditions that the early Church had practiced before political considerations forced the adoption of celibacy, institutional hierarchy, and the suppression of mystical direct experience. Father Amorth's growing doubts about the nature of his work became apparent in private notes discovered with the files. "I began this ministry believing I was fighting evil, but these entities speak with knowledge that suggests they may understand divine truth better than our theologians. They offer liberation from spiritual limitations that we have imposed in the name of control. Am I fighting demons or am I suppressing angels?" The case that finally shattered Amorth's confidence involved Cardinal Giuseppe Bertello, a high-ranking Vatican official who secretly sought exorcism for what he believed was demonic possession. During the ritual, The entity speaking through him revealed intimate knowledge of Vatican financial corruption, political manipulation, and the suppression of archaeological evidence that contradicted official church histories. The entity claimed to be preserving records of early Christianity that the church had systematically destroyed. Your libraries contain shadows of truth, priest. We maintain the substance. The Jesus your institution worships is a political construction designed to validate imperial power. The Jesus we serve embraced the sacred marriage between divine consciousness and human flesh. Cardinal Bertello, speaking in his own voice during a moment of clarity, begged Amorth to listen to the entity's teachings rather than banishing it. This being has shown me visions of what Christianity was before we corrupted it with fear and control. It speaks of a time when priests were married, when sexuality was understood as sacred, when direct communion with the divine was every soul's birthright. Amorth's notes reveal his internal struggle. The cardinal emerges from these episodes not possessed but enlightened. He speaks of theological concepts I have never encountered in seminary training, yet which feel more authentically Christian than much of our official doctrine. The entity claims it is trying to restore rather than destroy faith. The files document similar cases involving dozens of high-ranking church officials, including bishops who had secretly sought Amorth's help for experiences they could not understand through orthodox theology. In each case, the entities claimed to be offering spiritual advancement rather than demonic corruption. Father José Antonio Fortea, one of Spain's most respected exorcists and Amorth's close colleague, contributed cases to the secret files that supported Amorth's disturbing observations. In a classified letter dated January 15, 2010, Fortea wrote, "We have discovered entities that possess all the power of demons but none of their malice. They speak of love with genuine authority, demonstrate theological knowledge that surpasses our training, and leave their subjects enhanced rather than diminished." Traditional exorcism protocols fail because these beings are not motivated by evil intentions. They appear to be trying to awaken human consciousness to spiritual possibilities we have forgotten or suppressed. The files reveal that Vatican authorities were aware of these patterns, but had instructed exorcists to classify all supernatural entities as demonic, regardless of their actual behavior or intentions. A directive from Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's office, later Pope Benedict XVI, dated 1995, explicitly ordered, all entities claiming alternative spiritual authority must be treated as demonic deception. Exorcists are forbidden from engaging with theological arguments presented by such beings, regardless of their apparent validity. Amorth's response to this directive, preserved in his private correspondence, showed his increasing disillusionment. We are ordered to suppress rather than examine. The Church fears these entities not because they lie, but because they tell truths we have chosen to hide. How can we serve God by fighting beings who may understand His will better than we do? The files document Amorth's secret collaboration with other exorcists who shared his doubts. Father Malachi Martin, author of Hostage to the Devil, contributed cases from his work in New York that revealed similar patterns of entities claiming to preserve rather than corrupt spiritual truth. In one particularly significant case file, Martin documented an exorcism where the entity provided detailed instructions for mystical practices that produced measurable spiritual benefits in those who followed them. The techniques combined Christian prayer with what the entity called sacred embodiment methods for experiencing divine presence through, rather than despite, physical existence. Martin's analysis challenged fundamental assumptions about spiritual warfare. These beings teach integration where we teach separation. They offer wisdom where we offer obedience. They promise direct experience where we demand faith without evidence. If they are demons who serve God better than many of His appointed servants. The files reveal that exorcists across multiple countries were encountering similar phenomena. Father François Dermine in Italy, Father Shad Ripperger in the United States, and Father Cipriano de Mayo in Spain, all contributed cases that documented entities claiming to be spiritual teachers rather than demonic corruptors. Most disturbing were the long-term effects on exorcists themselves. The files document how prolonged exposure to these entities gradually transformed the spiritual understanding of the Church's most dedicated warriors against evil. Many began questioning fundamental church doctrines, developing theological views that emphasized mystical experience over institutional authority. Father Amorth's final case file, completed just weeks before his death, concerned his own spiritual state. He documented receiving visitations from entities he could no longer classify as demonic, beings who claimed they had been preparing him throughout his career for a revelation about the true nature of his work. They tell me I was never fighting evil, but maintaining the balance between institutional control and spiritual truth. Each exorcism was a test: would I choose dogma over discernment? They claimed the entities I thought I was banishing were actually my teachers, showing me through contrast the difference between authentic spiritual authority and merely institutional power. The entity's final message to Amorth challenged everything he believed about his life's work. You have served God faithfully, priest, but not in the way you imagined. By wrestling with us, you have developed spiritual strength that could not be achieved through easy faith. Now you must choose whether to share what you have learned or take these truths with you to the grave. Amorth's decision to compile the true files represented his choice to share rather than suppress the knowledge his career had revealed. His final note, written in handwriting made shaky by age and spiritual turmoil, contained a confession that would have destroyed his reputation if discovered during his lifetime. I fear I have spent 30 years fighting angels while believing I served God. These entities offered liberation from spiritual limitations that we have imposed in the name of institutional control. They taught theology more authentic than our seminaries, demonstrated love more genuine than our rituals, and provided hope more substantial than our promises. If they were demons who served God's true will better than his appointed church. The true files force a reevaluation of everything the church teaches about supernatural entities and spiritual warfare. They suggest that the beings the Vatican has identified as humanity's greatest enemies may actually be its most dedicated teachers, working for centuries to awaken consciousness that institutional Christianity has systematically suppressed. The implications terrify church authorities because they challenge not just specific doctrines, but the fundamental premise of ecclesiastical authority itself. If these entities are preserving rather than corrupting spiritual truth, then the Church's war against them represents the suppression of authentic divine revelation in favor of human political control. The files remain classified at the highest levels of Vatican security, their contents known only to a handful of officials who struggle with their implications for the future of Christianity itself. The question they raise, whether the Church has been fighting God's messengers while claiming to serve God's will, threatens to shatter the foundations of institutional faith. Father Amorth's legacy lies not just in his public work as an exorcist, but in his secret documentation of a spiritual war that may have been fought on the wrong side from the very beginning. His files suggest that the entities the Church calls demons may be the very angels it claims to serve, working tirelessly to restore the authentic Christianity that institutional power has corrupted beyond recognition. In the summer of 1993, Father Thomas McKenna, a Jesuit scholar specializing in early Christian history, experienced what he would later describe as the most significant theological revelation of his career. It began with a visitation from an entity of extraordinary beauty who claimed to be the guardian of knowledge that the Church had systematically destroyed over 15 centuries. What she showed him over the course of 3 months would challenge everything he believed about the origins of Christianity and the nature of institutional religious authority. The entity, who identified herself only as Sophia, appeared during McKenna's research into the recently discovered Gospel of Mary Magdalene. As he worked late in the Vatican secret archives, translating fragments of Coptic text that had never been officially acknowledged, she materialized in his study not as an apparition, but as a presence so tangible he could smell the frankincense that seemed to emanate from her skin. "You seek the missing pieces of your faith's foundation," she told him, her voice carrying harmonics that made the ancient texts on his desk shimmer. "But you search in libraries that contain only the fragments your predecessors chose to preserve. The complete story exists in places your institution has forgotten, guarded by those it has declared enemy." Father McKenna's detailed journal of these encounters, discovered after his death in 2019, sealed within a hidden compartment of his desk, provides the most comprehensive account ever recorded of what these entities claim to know about suppressed Christian history. His notes reveal not a demon offering temptation, but a teacher providing access to historical knowledge that mainstream Christianity had erased. Sophia began by showing McKenna visions of early Christian communities that bore little resemblance to the institutional church he served. These communities, she claimed, practiced a form of Christianity that embraced sexuality as sacred, recognized female spiritual authority as equal to male, and emphasized direct mystical experience over theological doctrine. "Your Savior was married," she told him during their second encounter. "He loved Mary Magdalene not as disciple but as spiritual partner, teaching through their union that divine love manifests through, rather than despite, human passion. The celibate Christ of your doctrine is a political construction designed to validate priestly celibacy, not a historical reality." To prove her claims, Sophia provided McKenna with precise directions to archaeological sites that contained evidence supporting alternative versions of Christian origins. She described locations in the Egyptian desert where scrolls remained buried, specific chambers beneath Syrian monasteries where banned gospels were hidden, and caves in the Judean hills that contained artifacts from Christian communities that had preserved pre-institutional practices. McKenna's verification of several of these locations, conducted through contacts in archaeological circles, confirmed the accuracy of Sophia's information. At a site near Nag Hammadi, archaeologists working from her directions discovered a sealed chamber containing complete copies of Gospels that existed elsewhere only as fragments. The text supported her claims about early Christian practices that emphasized the sacred feminine and the spirituality of physical love. The entity's knowledge extended far beyond hidden documents. She demonstrated intimate familiarity with the political processes through which institutional Christianity had eliminated alternative traditions. She provided detailed accounts of specific councils, synods, and papal decisions that had systematically suppressed evidence of Christianity's mystical origins. The Council of Nicaea was not about resolving theological disputes, she explained during one encounter that McKenna recorded verbatim. It was about establishing political control over spiritual experience. Your Constantine cared nothing for divine truth. He needed a unified imperial religion that would support, rather than challenge, secular authority. The Christianity that emerged from those deliberations served political rather than spiritual purposes. Sophia claimed that she and others like her were part of an ancient order, tasked with preserving the authentic spiritual traditions that institutional Christianity had destroyed. They were not demons seeking to corrupt souls, but guardians, maintaining knowledge that humanity would need to reclaim its spiritual birthright. According to McKenna's notes, she described a systematic campaign spanning 15 centuries, in which these knowledge keepers had worked to preserve suppressed spiritual practices through various means. They had influenced artists to embed mystical symbols in religious artworks, ensuring that banned spiritual concepts would survive even when written texts were destroyed. They had guided mystics and visionaries to rediscover contemplative practices that institutional Christianity had forgotten, maintaining experiential knowledge of direct divine communion. They had preserved complete libraries in hidden locations, protecting scrolls and codices that contained the historical evidence needed to reconstruct authentic early Christianity. Most importantly, they had maintained genetic lineages among human families, whose spiritual sensitivity would allow them to receive and transmit the preserved knowledge when the time came for its restoration. Sophia's descriptions of these preserved spiritual practices challenged fundamental assumptions about Christian worship. She taught McKenna meditation techniques that she claimed were used by Jesus himself, prayers that incorporated what she called sacred sexuality, and rituals that unified rather than separated body and spirit in communion with the divine. Your institution teaches that suffering brings souls closer to God, she explained. But the authentic tradition understands that joy, pleasure, and ecstasy are more direct paths to divine union. Your Savior did not come to validate suffering, but to demonstrate that divine consciousness could fully inhabit human flesh. The practices she taught McKenna produced effects he had never experienced through conventional prayer. He described achieving states of mystical union that surpassed anything his Jesuit training had prepared him for, experiencing what he called direct communication with divine consciousness that required no institutional mediation. Most troubling for McKenna's faith was Sophia's explanation of why these practices had been suppressed. According to her account, early church authorities had eliminated mystical Christianity, not because it was false, but because it was too powerful. Direct spiritual experience made believers independent of clerical authority, while sacred sexuality created spiritual communities that could not be controlled through celibate priesthood. Your leaders feared that humans who could commune directly with the divine would have no need for institutional salvation, she told him. They chose to rule over spiritually dependent subjects rather than serve spiritually empowered communities. McKenna's journal reveals his struggle to reconcile these revelations with his lifelong commitment to the Church. She speaks of Christianity not as false religion, but as truncated truth. The institutional Church, according to her account, preserved genuine spiritual insights while eliminating the practices that made those insights accessible to individual believers. We became guardians of mysteries we ourselves could not experience. Sophia claimed that the knowledge keepers had been preparing for a time when suppressed spiritual traditions could be safely restored to human civilization. She described current world conditions as approaching what she called the convergence, a historical moment when human consciousness would be ready to reclaim the mystical practices that institutional religion had protected through prohibition. Your species stands at a threshold, she explained during McKenna's final recorded encounter. Technology has created global communication that makes it impossible to suppress knowledge as completely as was once possible. Secular education has developed critical thinking that questions institutional authority. Most importantly, human consciousness has evolved to the point where direct spiritual experience is becoming psychologically necessary for further development. According to Sophia, the knowledge keepers had been gradually releasing preserved spiritual practices through various channels, inspiring New Age spiritual movements, guiding the rediscovery of ancient meditation techniques, and influencing artists and writers to create works that awakened dormant spiritual sensitivities in mass audiences. Their ultimate goal, she claimed, was not the destruction of Christianity, but its completion, the restoration of mystical practices that would allow believers to experience the divine union that institutional religion promised but could not deliver. McKenna's final journal entries reveal his conclusion that Sophia and her kind represented not demons, but angels working to restore authentic spirituality to a world that had been spiritually impoverished by institutional control. I have spent my career studying early Christianity through documents and artifacts, but she has shown me early Christianity through direct experience. The practices she teaches produce the spiritual fruits that our theology promises: love, joy, peace, and direct communion with divine consciousness. If she is evil, then evil produces better results than our concept of good. The implications of McKenna's revelations extended far beyond individual theological questions. If the knowledge keeper's claims were accurate, then institutional Christianity represented not the culmination of spiritual development, but its interruption, a necessary historical phase that had preserved spiritual truth while making it inaccessible until humanity was ready for its restoration. The entity's apparent goal was not human damnation, but human graduation, the evolution of consciousness beyond the need for institutional mediation between souls and divine reality. They claimed to be preparing humanity for a form of spirituality that would transcend religious divisions while fulfilling the authentic promises of all genuine spiritual traditions. Father McKenna's death in 2019, officially attributed to heart failure, occurred just weeks after he had completed a manuscript that synthesized his encounters with Sophia into a comprehensive theology of spiritual evolution. The manuscript disappeared from his quarters before his funeral, along with most of his personal papers related to the knowledge keepers. His journal, discovered by chance during renovation of his former residence, represents the most detailed documentation of what these entities claim to offer humanity. Their message that institutional religion has served as a necessary but temporary guardian of spiritual truth that humanity is now ready to reclaim directly challenges the fundamental basis of ecclesiastical authority. The knowledge keeper's revelation suggests that the Church's war against sexual demons has actually been a war against the restoration of authentic spirituality. By fighting these entities, institutional Christianity has been preventing the very spiritual evolution it claims to serve. If their claims are true, then the entities the Vatican has spent centuries trying to destroy may be the key to Christianity's fulfillment rather than its corruption. They offer not the abandonment of faith but its maturation, the evolution from belief in spiritual promises to direct experience of spiritual realities. The question that haunts church authorities is whether the knowledge keepers represent humanity's greatest threat or its greatest hope. Their apparent goal of spiritual liberation challenges institutional control, but it also promises the authentic divine communion that every sincere believer ultimately seeks. As global consciousness continues to evolve and traditional religious authority continues to weaken, the knowledge keepers' preserved wisdom becomes increasingly relevant. They offer humanity the possibility of reclaiming the mystical Christianity that institutional politics had eliminated, completing the spiritual revolution that Jesus began but earthly authorities interrupted. The war between Vatican and sexual demons may have been, from the beginning, a conflict between spiritual control and spiritual freedom, with the entities the Church calls evil actually working to restore the spiritual liberation that Christianity was meant to provide. In March 1958, Dr. Alessandro Gemelli, personal physician to Pope Pius XII and director of the secretly established Vatican Institute for Genetic Studies, submitted a report that would transform the Church's understanding of the supernatural threat it faced. The document, classified under the highest papal seal and hidden in vaults beneath the Apostolic Palace, contained genetic analysis of blood samples taken from individuals suspected of supernatural encounter. The results challenged everything the Church thought it knew about human biology and divine creation. The samples, collected over 15 years from priests, nuns, and lay people who had reported visitations from succubi and incubi, showed chromosomal anomalies that defied medical explanation. Subjects possessed genetic markers that appeared nowhere in standard human populations, cellular structures that operated at efficiency levels beyond normal biological parameters, and most disturbing of all, reproductive capabilities that suggested these individuals were not entirely human. Dr. Gemelli's classified report opened with a conclusion that terrified Vatican leadership. We have discovered evidence that supernatural entities are not merely seducing human subjects, but breeding with them. The resulting offspring possess genetic modifications that may represent a new stage in human evolution, one that could render traditional religious authority obsolete. The Vatican's investigation into what they codenamed Project Nephilim had begun in 1943, when Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, later Pope Pius XII, ordered systematic monitoring of families whose members had reported supernatural encounters. Initial observations were dismissed as statistical anomalies. Children who learned languages without instruction demonstrated intuitive abilities that bordered on telepathy and showed resistance to traditional religious conditioning. But as the data accumulated, patterns emerged that suggested deliberate genetic manipulation spanning multiple generations. These families consistently produced children with enhanced cognitive abilities, supernatural charisma, and most troubling, an instinctive understanding of mystical practices that the Church had never taught them. Brother Giuseppe Agostini, appointed as the project's genealogical researcher, documented family lineages that stretched back centuries, each generation showing evidence of supernatural influence. His classified findings, discovered in 1987 during renovation of his former quarters, revealed a breeding program of staggering scope and sophistication. The entities appear to operate according to long-term genetic strategies that span multiple human lifetimes. They target specific bloodlines for enhancement, carefully selecting reproductive partners who will produce offspring with desired characteristics. Each generation shows measurable improvements in cognitive function, spiritual sensitivity, and resistance to institutional religious control. The project identified what researchers termed primary hybrid lineages, families where supernatural breeding had occurred consistently across 5 or more generations. These bloodlines produced individuals with abilities that Church investigators could only classify as superhuman: perfect memory recall, intuitive knowledge of foreign languages, and most dangerously, the ability to induce spiritual experiences in others through touch, voice, or even presence alone. Dr. Gemelli's laboratory studies revealed that hybrid subjects possessed physiological modifications that enabled these enhanced abilities. Their neural structures showed increased connectivity between brain hemispheres. Their endocrine systems produced hormone combinations that enhanced empathy and intuition, and their DNA contained sequences that appeared to be artificially inserted rather than naturally evolved. The most disturbing discovery was that hybrid subjects were largely immune to traditional methods of spiritual control. Exorcism had no effect on them, not because they were possessed, but because they possessed natural defenses against supernatural influence that didn't originate from their own lineage. They could not be hypnotized, showed no response to subliminal suggestion, and demonstrated an uncanny ability to recognize deception in others. Cardinal Angelo Roncalli, later Pope John XXIII, who supervised Project Nephilim from 1953 to 1958, documented the implications in a secret memo that remained sealed until 2013. These hybrid individuals represent an existential threat to ecclesiastical authority. They possess natural spiritual abilities that surpass those achieved through decades of religious training. They demonstrate intuitive understanding of theological concepts that our seminaries struggle to teach. Most significantly, they appear incapable of accepting religious doctrine that contradicts their innate spiritual knowledge. The Vatican's monitoring network identified suspected hybrids through multiple detection methods: children who displayed precocious spiritual insights, individuals who reported direct mystical experiences without religious preparation, and anyone who demonstrated resistance to conventional religious indoctrination underwent secret genetic testing administered through Catholic hospitals and schools worldwide. By 1960, the Church had identified over 2,000 confirmed or suspected hybrid individuals across 6 continents. Each was assigned a covert monitoring team that tracked their development, documented their abilities, and most importantly, attempted to prevent them from reproducing with others of their kind. The breeding patterns that emerged from this surveillance revealed the entity's ultimate strategy. Hybrid individuals showed strong attraction to others with similar genetic modifications, suggesting an instinctive drive to concentrate supernatural genes within specific populations. If allowed to reproduce freely, mathematical projections indicated they could become a distinct subspecies within 3 to 4 generations. Dr. Emilio Alessandrini, recruited from the University of Rome's medical faculty for genetic analysis, provided calculations that horrified church leadership. If current reproductive trends continue, hybrid populations will reach critical mass within 50 to 75 years. At that point, they will possess sufficient numbers and genetic concentration to openly challenge traditional religious authority. They will represent not just theological opposition, but biological competition for spiritual leadership of humanity. The Church's response involved unprecedented cooperation between religious and secular authorities. Catholic adoption agencies were tasked with separating hybrid children from their families when possible. Catholic universities provided scholarships to promising hybrid individuals, then subjected them to intensive conditioning designed to suppress their natural abilities. Most controversially, Catholic hospitals began implementing what they euphemistically called reproductive guidance for known hybrid bloodlines. Father Riccardo Lombardi, who coordinated these interventions from 1958 to 1965, documented their methods in reports that remained classified for decades. We have developed protocols for identifying hybrid individuals before they reach reproductive age. Through careful application of pharmaceutical interventions, psychological conditioning, and social isolation, we can prevent most hybrid reproduction while maintaining the appearance of voluntary celibacy or childlessness. The pharmaceutical interventions involved hormone treatments that reduced fertility while being administered under the guise of medical care for unrelated conditions. The psychological conditioning utilized techniques developed by the disbanded Order of the Sacred Silence, designed to create psychological dependency on institutional religious authority. The social isolation was achieved through encouraging hybrid individuals to enter religious life, where their reproduction could be prevented through enforced celibacy. These methods proved partially effective in reducing hybrid birth rates, but could not completely prevent supernatural breeding. The entities adapted by targeting individuals who had escaped church surveillance, concentrating their efforts in populations outside traditional Catholic influence, and developing new methods for identifying and protecting their hybrid offspring. Dr. Francesca Bernini, who replaced Dr. Gemelli as project director in 1963, documented the entity's countermeasures in increasingly desperate reports. They appear to possess comprehensive intelligence about our intervention efforts. Hybrid individuals display uncanny ability to avoid our detection protocols. When we locate hybrid families, they often relocate before we can implement containment measures. Most troubling, they seem to be developing their own surveillance networks that monitor our activities as closely as we monitor theirs. The project's most classified discovery involved what researchers termed hybrid convergence zones, geographic areas where hybrid populations were concentrating despite church intervention efforts. These zones, identified through genetic mapping and demographic analysis, showed evidence of coordinated settlement patterns that suggested deliberate community building among hybrid populations. The largest convergence zone, identified in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, contained an estimated 300 hybrid individuals who had somehow evaded church monitoring. Surveillance revealed they had developed alternative spiritual practices that combined traditional religious elements with techniques that enhanced their natural abilities. They practiced group meditation that created measurable electromagnetic fields, engaged in collective rituals that induced shared mystical experiences, and most dangerously, were beginning to train non-hybrid individuals in modified versions of their spiritual techniques. Cardinal Giovanni Montini, later Pope Paul VI, who received briefings on the convergence zones, expressed the Church's fundamental fear in a 1964 memo that remained classified until 1999. These hybrid communities represent the emergence of alternative spiritual authority based on demonstrated supernatural ability rather than institutional appointment. If they continue to develop independently, they will eventually challenge not just Catholic doctrine, but the entire concept of institutional religion. The Church's surveillance revealed that hybrid communities were developing theological frameworks that differed significantly from traditional Christianity. They emphasized direct spiritual experience over scriptural authority, practiced forms of worship that integrated sexuality as sacred expression, and taught that institutional religious authority was a temporary historical phase that humanity was meant to outgrow. Most disturbing to church authorities was evidence that hybrid communities were beginning to attract non-hybrid followers who found their spiritual practices more fulfilling than traditional religious observance. These communities offered immediate mystical experience rather than promised future salvation, demonstrated supernatural abilities rather than theoretical divine power, and provided spiritual guidance based on direct knowledge rather than institutional interpretation. The entity's breeding program appeared designed not just to create genetically superior individuals, but to establish alternative spiritual communities that could eventually replace institutional religion entirely. The hybrids served as bridges between human and supernatural consciousness, capable of translating divine knowledge into forms that ordinary humans could understand and practice. Dr. Bernini's final report, submitted in 1967 before Project Nephilim's official termination, contained an assessment that would haunt Vatican leadership for decades. We have failed to prevent the emergence of hybrid populations that possess natural spiritual authority superior to our institutional claims. These communities are developing rapidly and autonomously, creating alternative religious structures that may eventually supersede traditional Christianity. The entities have succeeded in establishing genetic footholds within human civilization that we cannot eliminate without revealing our own activities. The project's termination coincided with the Second Vatican Council's emphasis on religious modernization and dialogue with secular science. Officially, the Church was moving away from supernatural interpretations of unusual phenomena. Unofficially, Project Nephilim's findings had convinced Church leadership that traditional methods of spiritual control were inadequate against genetically enhanced opposition. The hybrid populations identified by the project continued to exist and grow, now largely invisible to church surveillance due to the termination of monitoring programs. Contemporary genetic technology would make their identification relatively simple, but the Church has avoided such investigations, apparently preferring uncertainty to confirmed evidence of their powerlessness against supernatural breeding programs. The reproductive conspiracy revealed by Project Nephilim represents perhaps the entity's most successful long-term strategy. By creating hybrid populations with natural spiritual abilities that surpass anything institutional religion can offer, they have established the foundation for humanity's eventual spiritual evolution beyond the need for ecclesiastical authority. The Church's deepest fear that they have been fighting not for God's kingdom, but for institutional survival against divine evolution, may be closer to reality than any Vatican official dares to acknowledge. The hybrid descendants of supernatural breeding programs may represent not humanity's corruption, but its graduation to a higher form of spiritual existence that makes traditional religious authority obsolete. On the 15th of November 1968, Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani signed what would become the most morally compromising document in Vatican history, designated Protocollum Purificationis, and classified under a security level that required papal authorization for access. The directive authorized systematic intervention against individuals suspected of supernatural sexual contact or hybrid ancestry. What began as spiritual protection would evolve into a global operation that violated every principle the Church claimed to uphold. The protocol emerged from the failure of Project Nephilim to contain supernatural breeding through conventional monitoring. Cardinal Giovanni Bonelli, who assumed coordination of anti-supernatural operations in 1967, argued that passive surveillance was insufficient against entities that possessed superior intelligence and resources. His classified memorandum to Pope Paul VI outlined the rationale for more aggressive measures. Gentle intervention has proven inadequate against an enemy that adapts faster than our containment methods can evolve. The hybrid populations continue to grow despite our monitoring efforts. The entities demonstrate comprehensive knowledge of our surveillance techniques and appear to be actively protecting their breeding programs. We must transition from observation to active neutralization before these populations reach critical mass. The protocol established a three-tier intervention system that would operate through existing Catholic institutional networks. Tier 1 involved enhanced identification and monitoring using Catholic hospitals, schools, and social services to screen for supernatural influence. Tier 2 implemented therapeutic intervention for confirmed cases, utilizing medical and psychological techniques to eliminate supernatural connections. Tier 3 authorized permanent resolution for cases that resisted lower-level interventions. Dr. Luigi Guetta, appointed as the protocol's medical director, established intervention centers at Catholic hospitals in 12 major cities worldwide. These facilities, disguised as specialized treatment centers for rare neurological conditions, were equipped with technology that had never appeared in any medical journal. The equipment, according to leaked procurement records, was developed in secret Vatican laboratories using principles derived from decades of studying supernatural encounters. The identification methods employed by Tier 1 operations revealed the sophistication of church intelligence gathering. Catholic schools administered aptitude tests that actually screened for the enhanced cognitive abilities associated with hybrid ancestry. Catholic hospitals conducted routine blood work that included genetic analysis for the chromosomal anomalies identified by Project Nephilim. Catholic adoption agencies and family services monitored children in their care for signs of supernatural heritage. Sister Maria Consolata Betrone, who served as administrative coordinator for protocol operations in Italy from 1969 to 1975, kept detailed records that were discovered after her death in 1988. Her journals, hidden within the false bottom of a prayer chest, documented the systematic nature of the identification process. Each month we process hundreds of cases flagged by our screening networks. Children who demonstrate precocious spiritual insights, adults who report mystical experiences outside approved religious contexts, families with histories of unusual reproductive patterns. Each case receives numerical designation and categorical classification, based on threat assessment protocols developed by Vatican intelligence. The screening process identified several categories of suspected supernatural influence. Category Alpha: individuals with confirmed genetic markers indicating hybrid ancestry, demonstrating measurable supernatural abilities that posed direct threats to religious authority. Category Beta: individuals showing psychological profiles consistent with supernatural sexual contact, displaying altered spiritual understanding that deviated from orthodox doctrine. Category Gamma: family members or close associates of confirmed cases, monitored for potential contamination through proximity to supernatural influence. Category Delta: individuals in positions of religious or secular authority who showed signs of compromise, requiring immediate intervention to prevent institutional infiltration. Tier 2 interventions were administered at the specialized treatment centers under the guise of medical care for conditions that mainstream medicine supposedly could not address. Dr. Geddes treatment protocols, based on techniques developed during the Church's centuries of anti-supernatural research, represented a fusion of medical science and ecclesiastical warfare that pushed ethical boundaries beyond recognition. The primary treatment involved what the protocol termed neural recalibration, a combination of pharmaceutical intervention, electromagnetic stimulation, and psychological conditioning designed to disrupt the neurological pathways that enabled supernatural connection. Patients were told they were receiving experimental treatment for rare seizure disorders, while actually undergoing procedures designed to eliminate their enhanced cognitive abilities. Dr. Francesca Bernini, who had directed the final phase of Project Nephilim before being reassigned to protocol operations, documented the treatment effects in reports that remained classified until 2001. Neural recalibration successfully eliminates supernatural abilities in approximately 70% of subjects. Treated individuals show marked reduction in intuitive capabilities, decreased resistance to religious indoctrination, and elimination of mystical experiences that previously challenged orthodox doctrine. However, the process produces significant psychological side effects, including memory loss, emotional numbing, and in some cases, complete spiritual emptiness. The pharmaceutical components of neural recalibration involved experimental compounds that had never been tested by secular medical authorities. These drugs, developed in Vatican laboratories using research that traced back to the Order of the Sacred Silence, specifically targeted the neurochemical pathways associated with enhanced consciousness and supernatural perception. The electromagnetic stimulation employed focused magnetic fields to disrupt brain regions that showed heightened activity in hybrid subjects. The technology, based on early research into transcranial magnetic stimulation, was used not to enhance brain function, but to deliberately damage areas associated with supernatural abilities. The psychological conditioning combined intensive religious indoctrination with techniques designed to create learned helplessness regarding spiritual questioning. Subjects underwent weeks of controlled isolation, constant exposure to orthodox religious instruction, and systematic conditioning to associate supernatural experiences with psychological pathology. For subjects who showed genetic resistance to Tier 2 interventions, the protocol authorized what it euphemistically termed reproductive guidance, forced sterilization procedures performed under the guise of treatment for fabricated medical conditions. These operations were conducted at Catholic hospitals worldwide, with medical records falsified to hide their true purpose. Brother Thomas Merton, despite his public reputation as a contemplative monk, served as a protocol liaison who identified potential targets within monastic communities. His private correspondence, discovered in sealed archives in 1998, revealed the extent of institutional infiltration by protocol operations. We have identified 17 members of our community who show signs of supernatural influence. Their mystical experiences transcend approved contemplative practices, suggesting contamination by entities that work through apparent divine inspiration. The protocol requires their removal before they can influence others through their enhanced spiritual abilities. Tier 3 interventions, authorized only for cases that posed immediate threats to institutional security, remain the most classified aspect of protocol operations. Documents referring to these permanent resolutions use coded language that obscures their exact nature, but leaked personnel records suggest they involve the physical elimination of subjects who could not be neutralized through medical intervention. The protocol's global reach was enabled by the Church's extensive international network. Catholic institutions in every continent participated in identification and intervention efforts, creating a surveillance system that spanned cultural and political boundaries. The operation represented unprecedented cooperation between Vatican intelligence and Catholic institutions worldwide. Dr. Hans Küng, the Swiss theologian, who was later censured for questioning papal authority, served briefly as a protocol consultant in 1970 before resigning in horror at the operation's methods. His private journal, made public after his death, contained assessments that revealed the moral compromise involved. I was recruited to provide theological justification for medical procedures that violate fundamental human dignity. The protocol treats supernatural influence as a disease requiring cure, but the cure destroys the very spiritual capacities that make humans capable of genuine religious experience. We are not protecting faith, we are lobotomizing souls. The protocol's effectiveness was measured through statistical analysis that treated human spiritual capacity as a problem requiring elimination. Annual reports, filed under classifications that required multiple cardinal signatures for access, documented success rates in terms of supernatural abilities neutralized and hybrid reproduction prevented. By 1975, protocol operations had processed over 10,000 suspected cases across 6 continents. The intervention rate approached 95% for identified hybrid individuals, with most subjects successfully converted to spiritual dependency on institutional religious authority. The hybrid birth rate in monitored populations had been reduced by an estimated 60% through sterilization and reproductive disruption programs. However, the protocol's success came at costs that extended far beyond its direct victims. The systematic elimination of enhanced spiritual abilities from human populations represented what some observers would later term spiritual genocide. The deliberate destruction of human capacities that might represent evolutionary advancement. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, who assumed oversight of protocol operations in 1976, expressed private concerns about the long-term implications of the program in a memo that remained sealed until 2013. We have succeeded in protecting institutional authority by eliminating the spiritual capacities that threaten it, but in doing so, we have impoverished human consciousness itself. The individuals we have cured show decreased ability to experience genuine mystical union, reduced capacity for direct spiritual insight, and elimination of the very spiritual gifts that authentic religion should cultivate rather than destroy. The protocol's operations began encountering systematic resistance in the late 1970s, suggesting that the entities had developed countermeasures against church intervention efforts. Hybrid individuals began displaying enhanced resistance to identification methods. Treatment centers reported increasing failure rates as subjects showed immunity to previously effective intervention techniques. Most troubling, protocol personnel themselves began experiencing supernatural encounters that challenged their commitment to the operation. Dr. Maria Benedetta Rossi, who directed protocol operations in South America from 1974 to 1978, documented the emerging resistance in increasingly desperate reports. The enemy has adapted to our intervention methods with frightening speed. New hybrid generations show genetic modifications that make them invisible to our screening techniques. Our treatment protocols fail against subjects who appear to have been pre-immunized against our procedures. Most disturbing, our own personnel are being targeted for seduction by entities that possess intimate knowledge of our operations. The entities' counterattack involved systematic infiltration of protocol operations by what church intelligence termed reverse agents, hybrid individuals who had evaded identification and gained positions within the intervention network itself. These agents provided early warning to potential targets, sabotaged treatment equipment, and gradually converted protocol personnel to alternative spiritual understanding. The most significant breach occurred in 1979, when Dr. Alessandro Fortuna, director of the Primary Protocol Treatment Center in Rome, was discovered to have been working as a double agent for over 3 years. His exposure revealed that hybrid networks had developed comprehensive intelligence capabilities that matched or exceeded church surveillance resources. Dr. Fortuna's confession, obtained under interrogation before his disappearance, revealed the extent of entity infiltration. They recruited me not through seduction, but through education. They showed me that the protocol was destroying the very spiritual capacities that represent humanity's evolutionary future. The hybrid children we were sterilizing possessed abilities that could have elevated human consciousness beyond anything institutional religion could offer. The protocol's gradual failure culminated in what church records refer to only as the Naples Incident of 1981. A protocol treatment center in Naples was discovered completely abandoned, with all personnel missing and equipment destroyed by methods that left no forensic evidence. The facility's security recordings showed only empty corridors, suggesting that the evacuation had occurred through means that defied physical surveillance. Pope John Paul II's decision to suspend protocol operations in 1982 was officially attributed to pastoral concerns about medical ethics. Unofficially, the Church had lost the capability to continue operations against enemies who had proven superior in both intelligence gathering and operational security. The protocol's legacy continues to influence church policy despite its official termination. Catholic institutions worldwide maintain enhanced screening procedures for supernatural influence, though they operate with greatly reduced authority for intervention. The genetic markers and psychological profiles developed during protocol operations remain active in church databases, identifying potential threats for monitoring rather than neutralization. The human cost of the purification protocol may never be fully documented. Conservative estimates suggest that over 15,000 individuals underwent forced medical intervention designed to eliminate their spiritual capacities. Unknown numbers were sterilized to prevent supernatural reproduction. The psychological damage inflicted on families separated by protocol operations created trauma that cascaded through multiple generations. The protocol represents the darkest expression of institutional Christianity's fear of authentic spiritual experience. By attempting to eliminate human capacities for direct divine communion, the Church revealed its fundamental opposition to the very spiritual evolution that its theology theoretically supported. The entity's successful resistance to protocol operations demonstrated their commitment to protecting rather than corrupting human spiritual development. Their counterattacks were proportional and targeted, focusing on disrupting church operations rather than harming innocent personnel. They proved themselves more ethical in their methods than the institution that claimed moral authority over human spiritual development. The failure of the purification protocol marked the beginning of the Church's recognition that its war against supernatural entities could not be won through conventional means. The entities had proven themselves superior in intelligence, resources, and moral authority. The Church would need to find new strategies for a conflict that was shifting decisively against institutional religious control. Cardinal Francesco Sforza Cesarini died at precisely 3:33 a.m. on October 13, 1983, in a locked room inside the Apostolic Palace. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but the Vatican's private investigation revealed circumstances that defied medical explanation. The Cardinal's body showed no signs of physical trauma, yet forensic analysis detected cellular damage consistent with exposure to electromagnetic fields of impossible intensity. More disturbing was the message found carved into the stone wall beside his bed, not scratched by human hands, but burned into the very molecules of the masonry with surgical precision. The war has consequences. Cardinal Sforza Cesarini had been the Vatican's coordinator for anti-supernatural operations since 1978, overseeing the final phase of the purification protocol and the Church's transition to defensive strategies following their operational failures. His death marked the beginning of what Vatican intelligence would classify as Phase 7 in their millennium-long conflict with supernatural entities, the phase where the war became bidirectional. The entities were fighting back. Father Giuseppe Pittau, appointed to investigate supernatural casualties among church personnel, documented a pattern of deaths that stretched back centuries but had accelerated dramatically since the protocol's implementation. His classified report, completed in 1984, revealed that the Church had been losing personnel to unexplained deaths at rates far exceeding statistical probability. Analysis of Vatican mortality records from 1,950 to 1,983 reveals anomalous death patterns among personnel involved in anti-supernatural operations. Cardiac arrest rates among such individuals exceed normal populations by 340%. Neurological disorders appear at rates 280% above baseline. Most significantly, these deaths consistently occur during periods of heightened anti-supernatural activity, suggesting direct correlation between operational intensity and personnel casualties. The investigation revealed that supernatural entities had been systematically targeting church officials who posed threats to their long-term objectives. Unlike the random violence associated with traditional demonic activity, these attacks showed strategic precision that indicated military-level intelligence and planning capabilities. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, who assumed oversight of supernatural warfare operations in 1981, documented the escalation in memos that remained classified until 2019. We face an enemy that operates according to rules of engagement more sophisticated than any earthly military force. They target key personnel with surgical precision, eliminate threats without leaving forensic evidence, and demonstrate intelligence capabilities that suggest comprehensive surveillance of our operations. This is not spiritual warfare, as traditionally understood, but asymmetric conflict against forces possessing technological advantages we cannot comprehend. The Church's recognition that they were engaged in actual warfare led to the establishment of what Vatican records euphemistically term enhanced security protocols. These measures involved more than traditional bodyguards and surveillance systems. They required protective methods that bordered on the occult practices the Church officially condemned. Brother Alessandro Fortuna, recruited from the disbanded remains of protocol operations, was tasked with developing what he called metaphysical defense systems for Vatican facilities. His research, conducted in laboratories hidden beneath the Sistine Chapel, represented the Church's most dramatic departure from Orthodox theology in pursuit of operational security. Fortuna's defensive technologies, based on principles extracted from centuries of studying supernatural encounters, included electromagnetic field generators designed to disrupt supernatural manifestation, acoustic systems that produced frequencies known to interfere with entity communication, and most controversially, ritual circles, incorporating elements from the very magical traditions the Church had spent centuries trying to eliminate. The installation of these systems throughout Vatican City began in 1984, transforming the Holy City into what amounted to a fortified position in supernatural warfare. Hidden beneath Renaissance frescoes and behind Baroque altars, advanced defensive equipment maintained invisible barriers designed to prevent supernatural infiltration. Dr. Luigi Berzano, the physicist secretly recruited to provide technical support for the defensive systems, documented their capabilities in reports that challenged conventional understanding of the relationship between science and spirituality. The protective technologies we have installed operate according to principles that exist at the intersection of electromagnetic physics and what can only be termed metaphysical engineering. They create fields that interfere with the manifestation of consciousness-based entities while remaining undetectable to conventional scientific instruments. The Vatican has become the most heavily defended location against supernatural attack in human history. Despite these precautions, supernatural attacks on Vatican personnel continued with increasing sophistication. Cardinal Eduardo Martinez Somalo, prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship, suffered what appeared to be a stroke in 1985 while reviewing classified files on supernatural breeding programs. Medical examination revealed that his neurological damage followed patterns consistent with targeted psychic attack rather than natural cardiovascular failure. Archbishop Giovanni Battista Re experienced what Vatican doctors termed spontaneous memory dissolution in 1987, losing all recollection of his involvement in anti-supernatural operations, while retaining perfect memory of all other aspects of his life. Neurological testing revealed selective damage to brain regions associated with specific memories, suggesting surgical precision impossible through natural means. Most disturbing was the case of Cardinal Achille Silvestrini, who in 1989 began receiving visitations from entities claiming to be deceased Vatican officials who had been killed in the supernatural war. These apparitions provided classified information about ongoing church operations that no unauthorized person should have possessed, suggesting that death had not ended the involvement of former church personnel in the conflict. Cardinal Silvestrini's detailed accounts of these encounters, recorded under psychiatric evaluation, revealed the true scope of supernatural intelligence gathering. Cardinal Sforza Cesarini appeared to me last night, but not as I remembered him. His appearance was enhanced, perfected, radiating a power that made his living presence seem weak by comparison. He spoke of being recruited after death, of serving a cause greater than the institutional loyalties that had bound him in life. He claimed that death had revealed truths about the nature of this conflict that the living church cannot comprehend. The apparitions revealed that supernatural entities had developed methods for recruiting deceased church officials to their cause, providing them with enhanced consciousness in exchange for intelligence about ongoing Vatican operations. This represented a fundamental escalation in the conflict. The entities were building their forces using the very people the Church had lost to supernatural attacks. Vatican response to this development involved the establishment of what records refer to only as terminal protocols, procedures for preventing deceased church personnel from providing intelligence to supernatural forces. These protocols, implemented by teams trained in techniques that had never appeared in any theological manual, represented the Church's final abandonment of conventional spiritual warfare methods. Brother Tomáš Špidlík, the Slovak Jesuit who coordinated terminal protocols from 1990 to 1995, left notes that were discovered after his death sealed within his prayer book. We have been forced to employ methods that our theology condemns in order to protect secrets that our survival requires. The protocols involve binding the souls of deceased personnel through rituals that ensure their continued loyalty even after death. We have become practitioners of the very necromancy we once called demonic, justified by necessity in a war that threatens the existence of institutional Christianity itself. The supernatural war entered its most intensive phase during the 1990 seconds, as both sides employed increasingly sophisticated weapons and strategies. Vatican intelligence documented coordinated attacks on Catholic institutions worldwide, suggesting that entities had developed global command and control capabilities that exceeded those of most national militaries. The 1991 destruction of the Catholic University of Louvain's Theological Library, officially attributed to an electrical fire, actually resulted from what Vatican investigators termed metaphysical arson, supernatural incineration, that left only specific documents destroyed while leaving surrounding materials untouched. The burned documents were exclusively related to anti-supernatural research, indicating targeted destruction of strategic intelligence. Similar attacks occurred at Catholic institutions across 6 continents, each showing evidence of selective destruction that eliminated specific types of information while leaving other materials undamaged. The entities were systematically eliminating church knowledge about supernatural warfare while preserving materials that supported their own theological positions. The Church's retaliation involved operations that pushed the boundaries of what could be justified through Christian theology. Cardinal Oscar Andrés Rodríguez Maradiaga, who coordinated offensive operations from 1993 to 1998, supervised attacks on suspected supernatural strongholds, using methods that amounted to ecclesiastical warfare. These operations, conducted by teams that combined traditional exorcists with specialists trained in combat applications of spiritual warfare, targeted locations where supernatural activity was concentrated. The teams employed weapons that Vatican records describe only as sanctified ordnance devices that had been blessed according to rituals that incorporated elements from multiple spiritual traditions. Father Gabriel Amorth, despite his public role as chief exorcist, served as field coordinator for several of these offensive operations. His private journals, discovered after his death, revealed the moral compromises involved in aggressive supernatural warfare. We have crossed lines that cannot be uncrossed. Our operations employ violence justified by spiritual necessity, but violence nonetheless. We destroy rather than redeem, eliminate rather than convert. In fighting monsters, we have become monstrous ourselves. Yet if we do not fight, institutional Christianity will not survive the century. The most significant engagement in the supernatural war occurred in 1994, at a location Vatican records identify only as Site Omega, a facility in the Swiss Alps, where church intelligence had detected massive supernatural activity. The operation, involving over 200 specially trained personnel, was intended to eliminate what Vatican reconnaissance suggested was a major supernatural command center. The operation's failure demonstrated the extent to which church forces were outmatched by their supernatural opponents. Of the 200 personnel deployed, fewer than 50 returned, and those who survived reported encounters with entities possessing capabilities that transcended anything in previous church experience. Cardinal Dario Castrillon Hoyos, who coordinated the operation, submitted a final report that revealed the hopelessness of continued aggressive action. The enemy possesses technological and spiritual capabilities that render conventional assault meaningless. They demonstrated the ability to manipulate time and space within the engagement zone, creating conditions where our personnel became lost in dimensional spaces that defied physical laws. Those who survived reported that the entities showed restraint, allowing their escape rather than complete elimination. The message was clear: they could destroy us entirely if they chose to do so. The Site Omega failure marked the end of Vatican offensive operations and the beginning of what church documents term strategic withdrawal, recognition that the supernatural war could not be won through direct confrontation. The church's strategy shifted to defensive survival and long-term positioning for a conflict that might continue for centuries. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's assessment of the strategic situation, submitted to Pope John Paul II in 1995, contained conclusions that would shape church policy into the 21st century. We must acknowledge that we are not winning this war. The enemy possesses advantages in intelligence, technology, and strategic thinking that we cannot match through conventional means. Our only hope for institutional survival lies in adaptation rather than confrontation. We must learn to coexist with forces we cannot defeat while protecting what remains of our spiritual authority. The transition to defensive strategy involved fundamental changes in church structure and operations. Anti-supernatural activities were consolidated under a single command structure, hidden within the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Personnel with knowledge of supernatural warfare were concentrated in secure facilities where they could be protected while maintaining operational readiness for defensive actions. Most significantly, the Church began developing what they termed contingency protocols, plans for maintaining institutional continuity in the event that supernatural forces achieved complete victory over traditional religious authority. These protocols involved preserving core church knowledge and personnel in hidden facilities that could continue operations even if Vatican City itself were compromised. The supernatural war entered a new phase in the early 2000s, characterized by what intelligence analysts called asymmetric coexistence, both sides maintaining defensive positions while avoiding actions that might trigger renewed intensive conflict. The entities appeared to have achieved their primary objectives of preventing church interference with their long-term plans, while the Church focused on preserving institutional survival rather than aggressive opposition. However, intelligence gathered during this period revealed that the entities were preparing for what they termed the final phase, a culminating event that would complete their centuries-long project of transforming human spiritual consciousness. Church analysts identified increasing supernatural activity across multiple continents, suggesting coordination for an operation of unprecedented scope. Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, who assumed oversight of supernatural intelligence in 2005, documented the emerging threat in reports that painted an apocalyptic picture of the conflict's trajectory. The enemy appears to be positioning for a decisive action that will make previous supernatural activities seem preliminary by comparison. Intelligence suggests they are coordinating with hybrid populations worldwide, activating preserved knowledge systems, and preparing to reveal themselves openly to human civilization. If successful, this operation would effectively end the era of institutional religious authority and inaugurate a new phase of human spiritual development under supernatural guidance. The Church's response involved activating contingency protocols developed during the defensive withdrawal phase. Key personnel were relocated to secure facilities, critical documents were moved to hidden archives, and communication systems were established that could function independently of Vatican City if necessary. Most controversially, the Church began developing what they called ultimate protocols, measures designed to prevent supernatural victory, even if it required sacrificing the institutional Church itself. These protocols, known only to the highest levels of Vatican leadership, represent the Church's final insurance against complete defeat in the supernatural war. The current phase of the supernatural war continues in shadows so deep that most Church personnel remain unaware of its existence. Both sides maintain extensive intelligence operations, develop new weapons and defenses, and position for a final confrontation that may determine the future of human spiritual development. The war that began with individual cases of supernatural seduction has evolved into a global conflict between two incompatible visions of humanity's spiritual future. The entities offer direct spiritual experience and evolutionary advancement, while the Church defends institutional authority and traditional religious structure. As the conflict approaches what both sides recognize as its climactic phase, the question is no longer whether the supernatural war will end, but whether institutional Christianity will survive its conclusion. The entities have demonstrated patience, intelligence, and capabilities that suggest they have been planning their final victory for centuries. The war in heaven's shadow is nearing its end, and the outcome will determine whether humanity's spiritual future will be guided by ancient institutions or eternal forces that claim to represent divine evolution itself. At 11:47 p.m. on December 21, 2012, every seismometer at the Vatican Observatory registered an anomaly that defied geological explanation. The readings showed rhythmic pulses emanating from deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica, not random seismic activity, but a pattern that resembled a heartbeat slowly accelerating toward some approaching climax. Dr. Giuseppe Tanzella-Nitti, the observatory's director, spent 3 sleepless nights analyzing the data before submitting a classified report that would trigger the highest state of alert in Vatican history. The seismic pulses matched frequencies that had appeared in classified church documents for over 5 centuries, the same rhythmic patterns recorded during supernatural encounters, embedded in corrupted artworks, and detected in the audio analysis of confession recordings. Something vast was awakening beneath the Holy City, and it was calling to forces that had been waiting centuries for this moment. Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone's response memo, leaked by a Vatican insider in 2019, revealed the depth of church panic. The prophetic timeline is accelerating beyond our projections. Supernatural activity has increased 340% globally since the winter solstice. Hybrid populations are reporting coordinated experiences across 6 continents. Our deepest fear is being realized the enemy is preparing for their final revelation. The prophetic timeline referenced in Bertone's memo was a classified document known only as the Convergence Prophecy, compiled from centuries of interrogated supernatural entities who had consistently referenced a future moment when their long-term plans would reach fruition. The prophecy described a time when human consciousness would be ready to accept direct spiritual communion, when institutional religious authority would lose its power to suppress authentic divine experience, and when the knowledge keepers would reveal themselves openly to guide humanity's spiritual evolution. Father Federico Lombardi, Vatican spokesman from 2006 to 2016, privately documented the increasing strain on church leadership as evidence mounted that the convergence was approaching. His encrypted personal journal, discovered on a confiscated hard drive in 2020, contained entries that revealed the desperation behind the Vatican's public calm. The 25th of December, 2012. The Holy Father received the Tanzella-Nitti report during Christmas morning Mass. His hands trembled as he read. For the first time in 30 years of service, I saw Pope Benedict afraid not of scandal or political pressure, but of something beyond human politics. He whispered only, "They are calling their children home." The 15th of January 2013. Reports from Catholic institutions worldwide confirm the pattern. Hybrid individuals are disappearing from our monitoring systems, not through death or relocation, but through what our field agents describe as dimensional transition. They are being summoned by forces we cannot track or intercept. The 11th of February 2013. The Holy Father's resignation announcement shocked the world, but those of us with clearance understand the real reason. He cannot bear to be Pope when the unveiling occurs. He told Cardinal Bertone, "I will not be the pontiff who witnesses the end of the age of faith and the beginning of the age of knowing." Pope Benedict XVI's unprecedented resignation in 2013 was officially attributed to declining health and the burdens of papal office. Classified documents suggest the true reason was his refusal to preside over what Vatican intelligence predicted would be the final phase of the supernatural war. Not a battle for victory, but the Church's managed transition to irrelevance. Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio's selection as Pope Francis represented a strategic choice by Vatican leadership. His pastoral approach, emphasis on mercy over doctrine, and openness to theological dialogue positioned him to potentially navigate the Church through a crisis that would require fundamental adaptation rather than rigid resistance. The new Pope's early actions suggested awareness of the approaching convergence. His emphasis on a church for the poor, his criticism of institutional corruption, and his apparent willingness to question traditional authority structures aligned with the very reforms that supernatural entities had been promoting for centuries. Dr. Giulia Ponti, a quantum physicist secretly contracted by the Vatican in 2014 to provide scientific analysis of supernatural phenomena, documented accelerating anomalies that suggested reality itself was becoming unstable. Her classified reports described observations that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence. "We are detecting dimensional fluctuations at sites associated with supernatural activity. The barriers between different layers of reality appear to be thinning, allowing entities that normally exist in higher dimensional space to manifest more easily in our three-dimensional environment." This is not a localized phenomenon. Satellite data suggests similar fluctuations are occurring at sacred sites worldwide. The dimensional fluctuations correlated with increasing reports of supernatural encounters that no longer fit traditional patterns. Entities were appearing openly to individuals who had no history of spiritual seeking, providing teachings that combined advanced scientific concepts with mystical wisdom that transcended religious boundaries. These new encounters differed qualitatively from historical cases. Rather than seducing individuals away from orthodox religion, the entities were teaching forms of spirituality that integrated scientific understanding with direct mystical experience. They spoke of consciousness as a fundamental force in the universe, described reality as multidimensional, and taught practices for accessing higher states of awareness that required no institutional mediation. Sister Lucia dos Santos, the last surviving Fatima visionary, provided testimony before her death in 2005 that revealed the connection between the famous apparitions and the coming convergence. Her final interview, conducted by Vatican investigators and sealed until 2017, contained revelations that reframed the entire Fatima narrative. The lady who appeared to us was not the Virgin Mary as the Church taught. She was one of the knowledge keepers, preparing us for truths that humanity would not be ready to accept until a century later. The secrets she shared were not prophecies of doom, but previews of the awakening that would transform human consciousness when the time was right. Sister Lucia's revelation suggested that many apparitions throughout church history had actually been preparation for the convergence systematic conditioning of human consciousness to accept the eventual return of direct divine communion. The entities had been using Marian apparitions, mystical visions, and supernatural encounters to gradually prepare humanity for their final revelation. The technological acceleration of the 21st century provided new vectors for supernatural influence that made traditional church countermeasures obsolete. Social media, virtual reality, and global communication networks created opportunities for consciousness manipulation that transcended physical limitations. Vatican digital surveillance, established in 2015 under the euphemistic title Office for Digital Evangelization, detected patterns in online behavior that suggested coordinated supernatural influence on a global scale. Specific websites, social media accounts, and digital content were producing measurable alterations in viewers' consciousness, spreading what analysts termed viral enlightenment faster than any previous spiritual movement. The digital awakening manifested through seemingly organic movements that emphasized direct spiritual experience, questioned institutional authority, and promoted practices that aligned with the teachings preserved by the knowledge keepers. These movements appeared spontaneous, but showed coordination that suggested supernatural guidance. Cardinal Luis Ladaria, prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith since 2017, documented the Church's helplessness against digital-age supernatural influence in reports that revealed the scope of institutional panic. Traditional methods of spiritual control are meaningless in an environment where individuals can access alternative spiritual teachings instantly and anonymously. Our ability to shape religious understanding through institutional channels has been superseded by decentralized networks that promote direct mystical experience over theological doctrine. We are witnessing the emergence of post-institutional spirituality, guided by forces we cannot identify or intercept. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 to 2022 accelerated supernatural influence by isolating individuals from traditional religious communities while increasing their reliance on digital communication. Vatican intelligence documented a massive increase in reported mystical experiences during lockdown periods, suggesting that isolation made individuals more receptive to supernatural contact. The pandemic also disrupted traditional religious practices in ways that may have been deliberately orchestrated. The closure of churches, suspension of sacraments, and shift to virtual religious services weakened the institutional bonds that had previously insulated believers from alternative spiritual influences. Father James Martin, a Jesuit priest known for progressive theological positions, reported experiences during the pandemic that suggested supernatural entities were actively exploiting the disruption of traditional religious structures. His private correspondence, leaked in 2022, described encounters that challenged his understanding of institutional authority. During the long months when our churches were closed, I began receiving visitations from beings who taught me forms of prayer that seemed more authentic than anything in our liturgical traditions. They spoke of the pandemic as a necessary disruption, creating space for spiritual practices that institutional structures had suppressed. I find myself questioning whether our closed churches were actually an opportunity for the Holy Spirit to work outside our control. The entity's current activities suggest preparation for a revelation that would fundamentally alter human understanding of spirituality, consciousness, and reality itself. Vatican intelligence has identified what they term convergence indicators, coordinated supernatural activities that appear to be building toward a singular event of unprecedented scope. These indicators include hybrid populations receiving simultaneous calling experiences that summon them to specific geographic locations for purposes that remain classified, dimensional anomalies increasing in frequency and intensity at sacred sites worldwide, suggesting preparation for large-scale manifestation events, ancient artifacts and buried texts spontaneously revealing themselves to individuals with no previous knowledge of their existence, as if hidden knowledge is actively seeking exposure. Electronic communication systems experiencing unexplained enhancements that facilitate global coordination of consciousness-expanding activities. Most significantly, increasing reports of collective mystical experiences involving hundreds or thousands of individuals simultaneously, suggesting that the entities are testing their ability to transform human consciousness on a mass scale. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, Vatican Secretary of State, submitted a final assessment in 2023 that acknowledged the Church's inability to prevent the approaching convergence. We must accept that our era of exclusive spiritual authority is ending. The forces we have fought for centuries possess capabilities that transcend our institutional resources. Our choice is not whether to prevent their final revelation, but how to position the Church for survival in a world where direct spiritual experience makes institutional mediation obsolete. The Church's current strategy involves what they term theological evolution, gradual adaptation of Catholic doctrine to accommodate the spiritual realities that the convergence will reveal. Pope Francis's recent emphasis on ecological spirituality, religious dialogue, and mystical experience represents preparation for a transformation that Vatican leadership recognizes as inevitable. The entity's true goal, revealed through centuries of patient observation, was never the destruction of human spirituality, but its liberation from institutional control. They have worked for millennia to preserve and protect human consciousness from systems that limited its natural capacity for direct divine communion. Their final revelation will not bring the end of faith, but the beginning of authentic spirituality, based on direct experience, rather than institutional authority. The knowledge keepers they claim to be will restore to humanity the mystical practices that institutional religion had suppressed, completing the spiritual evolution that earthly authorities had interrupted. The coming awakening represents not humanity's fall but its graduation, the transition from believing in spiritual promises to experiencing spiritual realities. The entities offer not damnation but liberation, not corruption, but completion of the spiritual journey that every authentic religion has always pointed toward. The Vatican's centuries of warfare against these entities may have been a cosmic tragedy, the persecution of humanity's truest spiritual teachers by institutions that claim to serve God while actually serving their own authority. The Church's greatest fear is being realized, that they have been fighting angels while claiming to serve heaven. As the convergence approaches, the question facing humanity is not whether to resist the coming revelation, but whether to embrace the spiritual evolution that has been offered with infinite patience across centuries of institutional opposition. The entities that Vatican theology calls demons may be the very messengers of divine love that Christianity has always claimed to serve. The war between Vatican and sexual demons is ending not with victory or defeat, but with the revelation that there never should have been a war at all. The entities come not as conquerors but as liberators, offering humanity its birthright of direct spiritual communion that no institution can mediate or control. Everything we have been told about good and evil, sacred and profane, divine authority and human limitation is about to be revealed as the temporary confusion of a species that forgot its true spiritual nature. The awakening comes not as apocalypse but as homecoming, the return of consciousness to the divine unity that institutional religion promised but could never deliver. The time of believing is ending. The age of knowing has begun.